Chapter 27. A chance to enter the Kunlun party and cultivate? In the tavern, the plump old Ma sat at a table by the window. His stubby fingers caressed the jade pendant in his hand. After a while, he looked at Lu Chen with a strange expression. Lu Chen, who sat across from him, tilted his head back and drank a glass of wine. He shrugged and said, "At least that's what he said." Old Ma snorted and stared at Lu Chen. "Don't play dumb in front of me. I don't believe you can't hear the strangeness in those words." Lu Chen smiled but didn't say anything. Old Ma ignored him and continued, saying, "Everything in this world is the same. Look at the mortals in Qingshiteng village. They spend most of their lives working hard for an illusory chance. How can this kind of chance be so easily obtained?" Lu Chen said, "Maybe Hongchuan is a disciple of a famous sect, so it's not too difficult for him to get a chance to examine one's foundation." Old Ma sneered and said, "That's the Kunlun party, one of the top sects in Zhengxianming. Although it's no longer at its peak, a starving camel is still bigger than a horse. No matter what, it's not something a useless sect like the Thousand Autumn sect can compare to. Do you believe that the leader of the Thousand Autumn sect has to personally welcome a foundation establishment disciple of the Kunlun party?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "You're looking down on the Thousand Autumn sect too much." Old Ma sneered and looked as if he was clearly looking down on that stupid sect. Then he suddenly paused and looked at Lu Chen. "Speaking of which, what's that guy's cultivation level? If he's a foundation establishment disciple, he's an elite of the Kunlun party. It's reasonable for him to give you a chance to examine your foundation." Lu Chen frowned and said, "Hongchuan's foundation is very solid, but his cultivation level isn't too high. He should still be in the Qi cultivation realm and hasn't broken through to the foundation establishment realm." Old Ma shook his head and said, "That shouldn't be the case. Kunlun sect is such a famous sect with so many disciples. If it's just the most ordinary disciple in the Qi refining realm, no matter what, he wouldn't have such a big face. Unless there's someone behind him, well, an elder with a very high status in the sect, or he simply has a highly respected master." Lu Chen thought and smiled. "That seems to be true. Other than this opportunity, he also said that even if I don't have any talent, he can guarantee that I'll be a servant disciple of the Kunlun party. This is definitely something that only those with connections in the Kunlun party have." But Old Ma suddenly slammed the table with an indignant expression and said angrily, "Damn it. It's always you guys who secretly teach each other all day long. That's why talented people like me, who don't have any background, can't achieve their ambitions." Lu Chen coughed and reminded him, "I haven't gone to the Kunlun party yet." "How could I secretly teach each other?" Old Ma snorted and looked at him. "You're all jackals of the same tribe anyway." Lu Chen laughed and then raised his head to drink another glass of wine. He then smiled and said, "I won't go anyway." Old Ma was stunned for a moment, and then an unnatural expression flashed across his face. He sighed and said, "It's a pity that you had such a good talent back then, but it was destroyed by the vicious black flame curse." Lu Chen's eyes drooped slightly, and then he smiled. He stood up and walked to Old Ma's side. He patted his thick shoulder and said with a smile, "It doesn't matter. Anyway, I've lived a mortal's life for 10 years. I'm used to it now." Old Ma wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Lu Chen stretched himself and took the jade pendant from Old Ma's hand and put it back into his arms. Then he walked towards the door and said with a smile, "I was tired last night. I'm going back to catch up on sleep today." Old Ma didn't get up to see him off. He just silently watched the man walk out of the tavern and gradually go away alone. Looking from afar, he always felt that his back seemed a little lonely. The weather was sunny, and Qingshiteng village became lively. Miss Ding Dang, who usually liked to sleep in, woke up early again today. She was dressed neatly and her face was pretty. Walking through the village, she attracted many glances. Some were envious, some were infatuated, some were greedy, and some were jealous. However, she didn't care. She had seen these kinds of looks many times. At least in this village, she wasn't afraid. Even though 1,000 spirit stones was a large amount, it was no longer an unreachable amount. As long as she was lucky in the future, She would be able to gain the favor of the elders of the Thousand Autumns sect. These stinky men in the village, those stingy wretches who wanted to strip her naked with their eyes, and those hypocritical and jealous women, they were all ants under her feet. Thinking up to here, she couldn't help but feel a little light-hearted. The corner of her mouth revealed a trace of a smile as she looked at the surrounding village with disdain. Then, in her heart, she couldn't help but think, when the time comes, you guys will all kneel on the ground and beg me. But I definitely won't purify you guys. And young Master Li on the other side of the river is not bad. He looks quite pleasing to the eye. When the time comes, I can purify him. Also, Lu Chen, even though he's a lecherous, vulgar, and careless person who takes advantage of others every day, his personality is actually not bad. When the time comes, I'll purify him. Ding Dong's heart was filled with happiness. Suddenly, her eyes lit up as she saw Lu Chen walking over from a fork in the road in front of her. She stopped in her tracks and raised her hand to wave at him. She thought to herself, "Stinky man, I'm in a good mood today. Hurry up and tell me a few jokes to amuse me. In the future, I'll purify you." Who knew that today, Lu Chen seemed to have some thoughts in his mind. His eyes were always looking forward, and his face seemed to be deep in thought as he walked past. He actually didn't notice Ding Dong's greeting and just walked past her. Ding Dong was stunned for a moment, and immediately felt a burst of anger. She stared hatefully at Lu Chen's back and clenched her teeth. She thought to herself, "This stinky man is indeed useless. When I become an immortal in the future, no matter how much you beg me or kneel in front of me, I won't purify you." She turned her head and raised her chin like a proud peacock. She didn't look at Lu Chen anymore, but just happened to see that on the other side of Qingshui Creek, there was a group of women surrounding them. In the middle of the group, there was a handsome man standing with a smile. If it wasn't young Master Li Ji, who else could it be? Ding Dong's heart jumped. She couldn't be bothered with Lu Chen anymore. She lifted her dress and hurriedly walked towards the other side of Qingshui Creek. Chapter 28. Of course, Lu Chen, who was walking on the bluestone path, didn't know that in that instant, without any warning, without doing anything, he had already been removed from the mind of a certain woman who could possibly become an immortal in the future as a possibility of grooming him. But if he knew, he would probably smile wryly. He walked calmly on the bluestone path. He walked past the large locust tree, glanced at old Yu, who was fishing, and left the bustling crowd behind him. Then he walked toward the lonely thatched hut at the foot of the mountain that was gradually deserted. He opened the door, walked in, and closed it again. The inside and outside of the door seemed to be separated from the outside. An unremarkable stalk of grass floated down from the sky, slid in front of him, and slowly fell to the ground. Lu Chen looked at the stalk of grass. A trace of fatigue slowly appeared in his eyes. Then he walked over to the bed and lay down. He lay there quietly. After a while, he closed his eyes. His vision darkened, but then light shone again. He seemed to see lofty mountains, thousands of rivers, and a vast expanse in the distance, like an ocean. These illusions were what he saw when he immersed his divine sense into his body. To most mortals, this was a very strange and miraculous ability. Only cultivators who had cultivated the immortal Tao could possess this ability. With this divine sense that could peer into one's meridians and qi, one could observe the condition of one's body, including the 5 elements divine disk in one's qi, which most mortals yearned for. In other words, one didn't need magic treasures like the immortal mirror to see if one had the aptitude to cultivate. However, this seemed to be a paradox. This kind of divine sense could only be possessed by cultivators who had cultivated the immortal Tao, but those who hadn't cultivated before wouldn't have this kind of divine sense and thus wouldn't be able to see one's aptitude. Thus, mortals toiled their entire lives and paid countless spirit stones just for this pitiful opportunity. It was a pair of eyes in the unseen world. They crossed the mountains and rivers, flying forward and soon arrived at the ocean. On the path of cultivation, this was the manifestation of the qi, the foundation of cultivation. Every cultivator had a 5 elements divine disk in their qi, and on it were divine pillars that occupied the positions of the 5 elements. Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth were all different, but no matter who it was, if they wanted to cultivate, they had to have at least one pillar. With the fire pillar, one could practice the fire cultivation method. With the water pillar, one could practice the water cultivation method. With more 5 elements divine pillars, the range of cultivation method could be expanded accordingly. This was the fundamental principle of the human cultivation world for thousands of years. As for the strength of one's innate talent, it depended on the luster of the 5 elements divine pillars. They were all different, so he would talk about them in the future. At this moment, Lu Chen looked out and saw the clouds moving away and the wind blowing. Suddenly, everything was gone, leaving only an object rising up from the depths of the energy sea. It was the 5 elements godly disc. However, it was different from the dazzling godly disc of ordinary people. The godly disc in his body was charred black, withered and cracked in many places, and there was not a single divine pillar on the godly disc. Between those terrifying cracks, between the collapsed remains of the divine pillars, he could still see clusters and clusters of flames silently burning and tearing. They were like demons in hell, glaring at him with incomparable fierceness, using the most vicious curse to burn his soul, never to stop. His eyes were indifferent and expressionless. He just looked at the godly disc that was covered with cuts and bruises, and on the godly disc that symbolized the foundation of all cultivation, there was a continuous burning flame. That was a black flame that used his soul as fuel. It looked like it was entangled with him forever, and it would not stop until he died. Day after day passed. The affairs of the world were like the surface of the dragon lake, always calm and unperturbed. Everything went according to plan, and everything seemed to be peaceful. The only change was the newcomer, Li Ji. He was getting more and more liked by the girls in the village. His paintings were really beautiful, especially the court ladies. They were vivid and lifelike, so much so that people felt that they were even more beautiful than real people. Moreover, he was really very handsome. So the girls in the village flocked to him, pestering him all day, begging him to paint for them. Ding Dang was no exception. These days, she squeezed until her head was broken, and she was thick-skinned, waking up early and returning late. She was not afraid of other people laughing at her or gossiping, and she actually made Li Ji paint for her twice. Adding the first time, it was 3 paintings. 3 paintings, all of them were of her. One painting was Summer Night leaning on the window and gazing at the moon, another was Spring Wind Peach Forest admiring flowers, and the last was Palace Dress Girl chasing fireflies. 3 paintings, each of them were exquisite, each of them were beauties, as if condensed into the most beautiful moments of a girl's life, each beautiful figure reflected on the paper. Ding Dang loved these paintings. She carefully framed them and hung them in her room, on the same white wall. She would often stare at them in a daze, occasionally blushing and often smiling. On this day, she was once again looking at the paintings of beauties on the wall. Her eyes were slightly intoxicated. Suddenly she heard someone knocking on the door, causing Ding Dang to wake up. She walked out and shouted, "Who is it?" before opening the door. There was a figure standing outside the door, laughing at her, revealing his white and neat teeth. Ding Dang was startled and said, "Why is it you?" Lu Chen smiled as he walked past her, walked into the courtyard, looked around, and then said with a smile, "You speak like you are treating me as an outsider. In the entire Qingshitang village, I am probably the one who comes to your house the most." Ding Dong's face slightly reddened, and she smacked him, then closed the door, walked over, and said, "Glib tongue, why can't you change?" Lu Chen laughed, stood beside her, and then reached out to her shoulder, pulling Ding Dang into his embrace, and said, "Everyone is so familiar with each other, there is no need to put on an act." Ding Dang spat out a sentence, pushed him away, and took 2 steps to the side, but she did not seem to be angry, only pouting and sighing, and said, "I don't like it anymore." Lu Chen was startled, and the smile on his face disappeared. He frowned and thought for a moment, and said with some doubt, "Did I say something wrong or did I offend you?" Ding Dang shook her head. Lu Chen shrugged his shoulders. Since he did not do anything wrong, then there was nothing to worry about. His smile once again returned to his face, and then he walked over and stuffed 2 things into Ding Dong's hands, and said, "Let's go, let's enter the house." Chapter 29. Ding Dang did not know why, but her heart suddenly jumped. She lowered her head to look at her palm, where there were two beautiful and bright spirit stones. The beautiful light refracted in midair, and it looked as if there was a faint rainbow light lingering around the spirit stone, adding a bit of temptation to it. Lu Chen smiled and pulled Ding Dang. Ding Dang lowered her head, hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked forward, following him into the house. The spring wind was as gentle as a lover's hand, lightly blowing through the mountains and villages. The grass and flowers in the courtyard slightly trembled, and on the petals there were crystal-clear dewdrops. After the sound of breathing calmed down, under the soft bedding, they calmly lay on the bed. The world outside the house seemed to be separated far away, as if there were only the two of them left in the world. It was abnormally peaceful and tranquil. Ding Dang slowly sat up, using the quilt to cover the skin below her chest, and leaned against the wall beside the bed. Her face still had a bit of a captivating red, her gaze as gentle as water. Then she saw the three paintings hanging on the opposite wall. She stared at the paintings, looking at them for a long time. The expression in her eyes gradually changed. At this time, she suddenly felt something. Lowering her head to look, she discovered that the man had turned around and was also looking at her. "Why are you looking at me?" Ding Dang asked. Lu Chen smiled, reaching out his hand to lightly caress Ding Dong's cheek, then sincerely said, "You really are a beauty." Ding Dang bit her lips, then smiled, looking a bit happy, but then she looked at the opposite wall. After a moment, she said in a low voice, "Lu Chen, I don't want to be like this in the future." Lu Chen looked at her, smiled and said, "I don't understand, don't want what?" Ding Dang took a deep breath and said, "I don't want you to give me spirit stones and then sleep with you." The smile on Lu Chen's face faded, but he didn't seem to be angry. He just quietly looked at Ding Dang and after a while, said, "Are you trying to say that you don't want to sell your body for spirit stones anymore?" Ding Dang nodded and said, "Yes." Lu Chen replied with an "oh," and said, "Okay, I got it." After that, he got up, picked up the clothes on the side, and began to put them on. Ding Dang was still leaning on the bed, staring at him in a daze. When Lu Chen finished putting on his clothes, he turned around to look at Ding Dang, hesitated for a moment, then said, "Why is it? Can you tell me?" Ding Dang silently shook her head. Lu Chen smiled and said, "But since you don't produce and don't have any other way to earn spiritual stones, what are you going to do with the remaining spiritual stones?" Ding Dang pursed her lips and said in a low voice, "I have my own ways." "All right." Lu Chen shrugged his shoulders, turned around and walked out of the door. In the middle of this, his gaze swept across the white wall, stopping on the three paintings hanging on it for a moment. Then he turned around and said to Ding Dang, "These paintings, they draw you quite beautifully." Ding Dang giggled, her snow-white shoulders were bare, and she hugged the blanket tightly to cover her chest. Then her laughter became more and more joyful, louder and louder. Finally, when Lu Chen was about to walk out of the door, he heard her shout from the bed behind him, saying, "Thank you." Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment, then he turned around and smiled towards the room. "No need to thank me, I also like being with you." Finished speaking, he waved his hand towards the room, then turned around and walked out with large steps. Inside the room, Ding Dang, who was sitting on the bed, stared blankly at the man's disappearing figure, slowly biting her lips. The smile on her face gradually disappeared, then she grabbed the blanket even tighter, tightly wrapping her body, as if she was feeling a little cold. There were no other customers in the tavern, so only Lu Chen and the tavern manager Old Ma sat opposite each other. Old Ma poured a cup of wine for him, then said, "Seems like there's nothing else." Lu Chen looked at him and said, "What do you mean?" Old Ma moved his butt, letting his slightly fat body sit more comfortably, then said, "About the three realms demon sex diagram, I found a few suspicious people, but in the past few days, they have all been investigated and should have nothing to do with them." Lu Chen nodded his head, picked up the wine cup in front of him and drank a mouthful. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "That newcomer Li Ji?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "He has nothing to do with the demon sect, he is just a mortal." Lu Chen responded, and for some reason he seemed to believe Old Ma's words very much, but although his expression looked calm, There seemed to be a trace of gloominess. Old Ma did not notice this and continued to say, "But speaking of this Li Ji, recently there have been some rumors saying that this person is not from an ordinary family, but from an aristocratic family. Originally his family was wealthy, unfortunately an accident happened, and his family fell, so he ended up here." Lu Chen's eyebrows slightly raised, looked at Old Ma and said, "Aristocratic family?" Old Ma laughed and said, "That's what the rumors say, probably because of this. Li Ji does not know anything else, but he is proficient in zither, chess, calligraphy and painting. By the way, I heard that because his family was wealthy in the past, his family was on good terms with a certain cultivation sect, and one of the sect's elders once showed him the kindness to examine his talent, and it was confirmed that he has an extraordinary innate talent, and in his chi ocean, there is not only the 5 elements disc for cultivation, but also 2 pillars of metal and water, which is a rare metal and water spirit vein." Lu Chen placed the wine cup in his hand on the table and smiled, but did not speak, his expression thoughtful. Old Ma did not mind, and continued to say, "That's why everyone in the village is saying that as long as this young Master Li gathers 1,000 spiritual stones and visits the Thousand Autumns sect with the celestial mirror, he will definitely be accepted as a disciple of the sect." Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "So this young Master Li Ji is no ordinary person?" "That's right." Old Ma smiled and said, "Nowadays, many people in the village are sucking up to him, especially those women. They surround him like crazy. Sai, he's young and handsome, and he's even talented. There's nothing I can do to be envious of him." Lu Chen smiled and pushed the wine cup forward and said lightly, "Pour the wine." When the sky darkened, Lu Chen walked on the bluestone path beside Qingshui Creek, the night breeze blowing on his face, bringing a faint chill. The scenery of Qingshui Creek under the night sky was different from the scenery during the day. The reflection of the water in between the shadows of the trees was like pieces of glass that had been cut into pieces, sparkling and sparkling, reflecting every spot of light. Chapter 30. There were ripples in the wind. The bamboo swayed and the peach trees trembled. He walked to the foot of the mountain and entered the grass hut. There was no one in the grass hut, just like any other day. Lu Chen watched the gray stalk of grass slowly fall and then turned to close the door. He walked to the bed and lay down. In the darkness, the strange wailing sounds came from outside the window. He quietly lay in the darkness, letting the darkness gradually swallow his body, as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. The night deepened and the wind was like the wailing of ghosts. No one seemed to remember the lonely grass hut at the foot of the mountain. But at a certain moment in the night, suddenly, in the grass hut, in the deepest part of the darkness, there was a muffled grunt. Lu Chen's eyes suddenly widened. There was darkness in front of him, but it was like a terrifying flame was burning. Black fire. Black fire burst out from every corner of his body, like a dancing poisonous snake, wildly twisting, burning all the flesh on his body, but not damaging any of his clothes or bedding. Everything was silent, but it was as if the heavens and earth had suddenly collapsed. The miserable cries surpassed all the wails in the world. After a moment, the bed suddenly trembled, and then he disappeared. The next moment, Lu Chen landed on the ground and once again came to the mysterious tree hole-like space. Under the soft illumination of the light, the black flames had already ignited Lu Chen's entire body, turning him into a flaming man. He cried out in pain and then staggered towards the puddle of water in the center of the tree hole. Voila! Water splashed in all directions. He once again entered the dark green and abnormally lush water. Almost at the same time he entered the water, the wildly burning black fire was immediately suppressed. The fire slowly weakened and then began to shrink back into Lu Chen's body. Everything seemed to be the same as last time. The water rippled gently, and the strange life aura in this water continuously seeped into Lu Chen's body, healing the terrifying wounds caused by the black flames one by one until not a single scar could be seen. After an unknown amount of time, Lu Chen slowly sat up straight in the water. He glanced at his body and then looked at the pool of water beside him. The color of the water was light green. It swayed slightly and looked very beautiful. However, 10 years ago, when he first discovered this place, This pool of clear water was a deep green color. At that time, the vitality here was so thick that it seemed like it could be breathed. But now, it was getting thinner and thinner. As for the black fire, it seemed to be acting up more and more frequently. The last bit of green in the water disappeared. What would be the fate that awaited him? Dripping wet, he sat in the water for a long time without getting up. His expression was indifferent as he silently pondered. This spring seemed to be slowly passing by. The weather began to heat up and the days brightened earlier and earlier. However, the spirit tea trees on the tea mountain became more and more luxuriant. Cicadas were already chirping on the big pagoda tree by Qingshui Creek. The old fisherman was still fishing under the tree. One morning, when Lu Chen woke up, he saw smoke rising from the chimneys of the village at the foot of the mountain. He was wondering if he should make up his mind today when he suddenly saw a figure walking towards his straw hut. Separated by a distance, he could tell that it was Ding Dang. After that day, he never went to find Ding Dang again, and Ding Dang naturally did not come to find him either. The two of them, who were once close and familiar, suddenly became strangers. Until today, she suddenly came to this grass hut. When the sunlight shone down, Lu Chen discovered that Ding Dang, who had just walked out of the grass hut, was slightly out of breath. Her chest was slightly heaving up and down, and her cheeks were slightly red. She was still as beautiful as ever. After seeing Lu Chen, Ding Dang smiled at him and then happily called out to him, saying, "Hey, long time no see." Lu Chen smiled and nodded, "Yes." Ding Dang turned her head and looked around. Looking at the tea mountain and the village at the foot of the mountain, she sighed and said, "So living at the foot of the mountain is peaceful and the scenery is good. If I had known earlier, I would have also come to live here." Lu Chen laughed, "When night comes, you won't like it here." Ding Dang laughed, then looked at Lu Chen and said, "How have you been recently?" Lu Chen said, "Pretty good, how about you?" Ding Dang said, "I'm also pretty good." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's good." Following that, they suddenly did not speak, as if they had nothing to say, but also as if they were a little embarrassed. Even if they deliberately pretended that nothing had happened, it would not help. The silence continued. The two people seemed to be at a loss. After a moment, it was Lu Chen who lightly coughed and said, "What did you come to find me for?" Ding Dang thought for a moment and said, "There is something I want to tell you." Lu Chen said, "Oh, go ahead." "Can you lend me 300 spirit stones?" Ding Dang suddenly asked after a moment of silence. Lu Chen suddenly became silent and looked straight into Ding Dong's eyes. Ding Dang looked a little embarrassed, her gaze was a little flustered. She subconsciously looked away, but then seemed to think of something. She gathered her courage and turned her head to look at Lu Chen and then asked in a soft voice, "Can I?" Lu Chen did not agree, nor did he refuse. After quietly looking at Ding Dang for a while, he opened his mouth and asked, "What do you want?" Ding Dang was a little surprised at Lu Chen's unusual calmness, but she did not have the time to think about it. After taking a deep breath, her face showed some hesitation. She wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, she still sighed and said, "I have an urgent need." Saying that, she secretly looked at Lu Chen and hesitated for a moment before saying, "If this amount is too big, why don't you lend me 200 spirit stones first, is that okay?" Lu Chen was silent for a while and said, "Are you in a hurry?" Ding Dang heavily nodded and said, "Very." Then she softly said, "The people in this village are all. I really can't think of anyone else who can help me, so I came to find you." Lu Chen smiled and slightly lowered his eyes. After a while, he said, "I don't have that many spirit stones on me right now. Wait for me for a day, I'll see if I can gather them." Ding Dang was overjoyed and cheered. Then she smiled and nodded her head repeatedly. The peaceful and plain life continued. The people of Qingshitang village welcomed summer after the warm and beautiful spring. But other than the weather gradually becoming hotter and the chirping of cicadas in the trees, it seemed that the life of the village did not change much. Until the 4th day of the 6th month, a piece of news suddenly spread, causing this peaceful little village to be in an uproar. Chapter 31. For the first time in decades, An accomplished immortal master from the Thousand Autumns sect took a fancy to a young man in Qingshitang village. After the young man paid the fee and passed the mirror of immortality, the immortal master from the Thousand Autumns sect was right. This young man was gifted and was accepted as a personal disciple. When the news spread, Qingshitang village was in an uproar. Everyone spread the news. Countless people were envious and jealous. The luckiest young man was the man of the hour in the village, the suave young master Li Ji. In today's world, entering an immortal sect was like a carp leaping through the dragon's gate. From then on, one's life would be completely different. The young man who was smiling warmly and painting for the girls by the stream yesterday was now like a god standing high above the clouds, looking down on all living things. No one could get close to him anymore. As a result, the women in the village often sighed with regret. There were also people who carefully mounted their old pictures and hung them on the wall to look at them every day, treating them as memories that they could recall for the rest of their lives. As for more wishful thinking, no one really thought about it. Occasionally, when they gathered together to talk about young Master Li, they would laugh and argue that he was nicer to them back then. The weather was getting hotter, and fewer people came to drink. Business in Old Ma's tavern was very bleak. Most of the time, only Lu Chen, who ate and drank for free, came to his tavern. This made Old Ma's mood not very good. In addition, he had not cultivated to the point where he was immune to heat and cold. As a fatty, it was especially easy for him to sweat on hot days, so he was a little irritated. On this day, Old Ma looked at the only customer in his tavern. He was getting more and more annoyed. He said to Lu Chen, "Hey, you already owe me a big debt, and you still have the nerve to come here and eat for free?" Lu Chen laughed and drank the wine in his glass in one gulp. Then he leaned against the table and said to Old Ma with a smile, "Nowadays, the one who owes the debt is the boss. Don't you know?" But Old Ma spat at him and then wiped the sweat on his forehead with the towel beside him. He walked to the table opposite Lu Chen and sat down. He looked out of the window at the village where the sun was shining brightly and sighed, "Look at the people outside. They work themselves to death from day to night. What's the point of it? Look at that Li Ji. He hasn't been here for long, but he's already in the Thousand Autumns gate. People really can't be compared." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "Aren't you being sarcastic? People who have nothing and want to cultivate are all like this." Old Ma clicked his tongue, but he did not refute Lu Chen's words. He merely shook his head and said, "That Li Ji fellow is really lucky." Lu Chen quietly looked at an unknown direction in the distance outside the window. After staring silently for a while, he turned his head and said to Old Ma, "This is just a chance for that person. There's nothing to care about. But the matter of the evil sect pattern, you still can't find any clues?" Old Ma heard this and scratched his head in distress. He bitterly smiled and said, "Yes." Lu Chen snorted and said, "That pattern can't be carved there for no reason. Something must have happened in this village. Be more careful." Old Ma sighed and said, "It's not like you don't know. I've secretly searched this village many times, but I really can't find anyone suspicious. It's like I've seen a ghost. Those evildoers from the evil sect must be too bored. They just drew a pattern and ran away." Lu Chen was silent. After a while, he placed the wine cup on the table and stood up. He said, "I'm going back." By the Qingshui stream, the green bamboos were still green, but the peach blossoms had already withered. It looked a little lonely. Under the blazing hot sun, there were very few people walking on the green stone path. Lu Chen walked along the side of the stream. Just as he was about to walk past the stone bridge, he suddenly saw a familiar figure walking over from the other side of the stream. It was Ding Dang. Lu Chen stopped walking. Ding Dang, who was standing on the stone bridge, also saw Lu Chen. Her face flashed a trace of astonishment. She then smiled and greeted him, but her smile was somewhat forced. The two of them walked to the shade of the green bamboos to talk. Ding Dang looked a little uneasy, but she quickly smiled and said to Lu Chen, "It's been a while." Lu Chen sized her up and nodded his head. "Yes, I haven't seen you in a while. Where did you go?" Ding Dang said, "No, I'm suffering from the summer. I hate this hot weather the most, so I don't like to go out." Lu Chen nodded his head and replied. Then the two of them sank into silence. After a while, perhaps feeling a little awkward, Ding Ding pursed her lips and said, "That I owe you spirit stones. You will have to wait a little longer. I will return it to you soon." Lu Chen said, "No worries, I don't have anything urgent." Ding Dang looked like she was relieved and her mood was much better. She actually stuck out her tongue and said with a smile, "Don't worry, I will definitely not renege on my debt. I said I will return it to you and I will definitely return it to you. Moreover, when the opportunity comes, I will also bestow you with a heavenly fortune." Heavenly fortune? Lu Chen raised his eyes and looked at Ding Dang. Ding Dang smiled sweetly and nodded her head heavily. She was in high spirits as if she already had power in her hands and the confidence to control other people's lives. Deep into the night, at the foot of Tea Mountain, the heat of the day had completely dissipated. What replaced it was a cool and refreshing cold wind that blew down from the mountain. Those strange sounds that sounded like the wailing of ghosts and the howling of wolves sounded out once again. It was like a ghost palace in hell, causing one's heart to palpitate. The grass hut at the foot of the mountain stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by the endless night. The grass hut was silent. The doors and windows were tightly shut. Although it could not block out the strange sounds, it was still like a strange little world. There was no one in the hut. In the darkness, one could not even hear the sound of breathing. One could only see a blurry shadow and an overturned bedboard. In the mysterious space of the tree hole, Lu Chen sat on the ground. He looked at the light green puddle in front of him with a serious expression. He looked solemn. His eyebrows were tightly knitted as if he was deep in thought. It was as if there was something he was hesitating about. Around him, the tree hole was quiet. The gray chi wrapped around the ancient tree walls were like gentle water ripples, gently flowing and undulating. After an unknown period of time, suddenly, Lu Chen's eyes opened, as if he had finally hardened his heart and made a decision. He took a deep breath, and a strange black light flashed across his face. A moment later, there was a faint glimmer of light coming from his lower abdomen, which was the most important place for all cultivators, the Dantian and the Sea of Qi. Chapter 32. The Dantian Sea of Qi was the most vital point for all cultivators who cultivated the immortal Tao. But for Lu Chen, the terrifying black fire from 10 years ago was like a bone-piercing awl that had completely destroyed his foundation. He could neither live nor die, and he had repeatedly suffered the terrible pain of being burned by the black fire. This was also the first time in 10 years that he actively stimulated the qi in his dantian. From another point of view, this was equivalent to him actively activating the black flame curse. Sure enough, just as he tried to activate the qi in his dantian, when his completely damaged 5 elements disc trembled slightly and was about to take shape, a demonic black fire suddenly rolled up from the bottom of the disc, emerging from the depths of every hideous crack and wound, like the silent but terrifying laughter of an evil spirit. The black fire instantly spread throughout his Dantian Sea of Qi, and then rushed out in all directions. The black fire burned his body. Lu Chen roared in pain, and the black fire crazily penetrated through many corners of his skin. His flesh trembled, and instantly turned into terrible scorched earth. However, this time, Lu Chen didn't directly throw himself into the only light green puddle that could save him like he did in the past. With unimaginable willpower, he forcefully sat upright on the spot, forcefully enduring all of the pain. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the puddle before him. His face was reflected in the water, like an evil spirit burning with black fire. Even his eyes seemed to be burning with black flames at this moment. Lu Chen groaned, the muscles on his face twisting, and then suddenly, in his Dantian Sea of Qi, the damaged 5 elements disc seemed to be activated by some kind of power and began to slowly rotate. Every time it spun, Lu Chen's entire body seemed to tremble once. The black flames were like an enraged demon. With a loud rumble, they surged forward with incomparable ferocity, completely engulfing the damaged divine disc phantom. Everything seemed to be on the verge of being incinerated by this terrifying black fire, including his flesh, blood, and soul. The water in the nearby puddle was calm, but it was like the world's greatest temptation, quietly lying in front of Lu Chen. There were a few times when Lu Chen's body couldn't help but lean forward, wishing that he could roll into the icy cold water just like he did in the past. But for some reason he still endured. He howled in the terrible black fire. At this moment there seemed to be not an inch of his body that was intact, and even his face looked somewhat deformed. But in the black fire, there was still a light, although weak, still flickering. That light came from his dantian, the 5 elements disc that was damaged to the extreme, burned by countless black flames. Even if it looked like it was about to collapse in the next moment, about to break into pieces and be completely destroyed, until now, this 5 elements disc was unusually tenacious, that white light still didn't extinguish. All of a sudden, all of the black flames on Lu Chen's body shrank back into his body. They traveled through his meridians and meridians like lightning and rushed back to his dantian. Like a tsunami, they crazily rushed towards the 5 elements divine disc. That place was the final foundation of Lu Chen's flesh and soul, and also the fundamental place where the black fire curse resided. As if in this silent world, suddenly there was an earth-shattering sound, and in an instant, all the black fire wrapped around the disc shone brightly, the black light engulfing everything. Lu Chen screamed in pain. In his dantian, that light dimmed, and the 5 elements disc finally couldn't resist this terrible curse, collapsing piece by piece, just like his body and soul, on the verge of dispersing. In this split second, suddenly, Lu Chen roared. His right hand suddenly turned over, a bright light appeared, and a black and incomparably sharp dagger suddenly appeared in his hand. At this moment, his face was as cold as ice, not even the slightest emotion could be seen. With a flip of his hand, he directly stabbed this black dagger into his lower abdomen. His charred abdomen split open in an instant, and he howled to the sky. Then, his left hand formed a claw, and suddenly stabbed it into his dantian. At the same time, the last of his remaining strength was frantically circulating. That badly damaged 5 elements disc trembled as it welcomed the attack. He grabbed it, as if he was holding his own heart, and slowly pulled it out. The black fire burned crazily, rolling, and was about to sweep up along his wrist, but Lu Chen suddenly sank his hand, and the next moment his entire left hand sank into that pool of blue water. An incomparably dense life force surged over from all directions, surrounding the black flame. The black flame slowly left his palm, but it did not extinguish. It was still burning fiercely under the water, but it was gradually trapped in a wave of water. Lu Chen's body trembled violently. No one, especially a person whose physique was almost the same as an ordinary person, could withstand such a heavy injury. Right now, there was no trace of blood on his face. He slowly lowered his head, his body powerlessly fell forward. With a roll, he also fell into that pool of blue water. With a hoarse sound, a splash of water slowly fell down. Then, everything returned to tranquility, and there was no longer any sound. It was quiet in the tree hole, as if time had stopped here. One could faintly see the mysterious old rings on the ancient tree walls. It was unknown how many years had passed under the crisscross scars, but they were quickly covered by the gray aura. Crash! Suddenly a burst of water sound broke the silence here. Lu Chen suddenly sat up from the water, and then with great difficulty, slowly climbed out. Just like before, the black fire burns on his body once again miraculously disappeared, including the wound on his abdomen. And this pool of blue water was like the legendary water of immortality, time and time again pulled him back from the brink of death. But just as he climbed to the ground, gasping for breath, when he accidentally turned his head, suddenly, Lu Chen's body shook, as if he saw something shocking. He was dumbfounded. In the small pool of blue water beside him, the dark green color that symbolized the unimaginably rich life force completely disappeared. At this moment, the puddle looked like an ordinary little pond. Lu Chen was stunned for a while. After a while, he slowly stood up, suddenly saw that under the clear water, there seemed to be a black shadow in the water. Chapter 33. Lu Chen was taken aback. He looked carefully and saw that in the depths of the water, there was a ball of water that was much more solid than its surroundings. It actually formed a round ball of water that floated motionlessly in the water. And in the center of the transparent ball of water, a small black flame was silently burning. Lu Chen silently looked at the small black flame and suddenly smiled bitterly. He didn't know why, but he strangely felt a sense of familiarity. At this moment, his whole body was powerless and incomparably weak. He slowly took a few steps back and then fell to the ground. After catching his breath for a moment, he sat down cross-legged and used his divine sense to examine his body. Under the nourishment of the mystical water of life, the terrifying wound in his dantian had actually healed. It looked empty, as if nothing had happened. Everything seemed to be starting over again. Lu Chen sat quietly. After a while, suddenly, in his dantian, a breath emerged. Then, like a miracle in his dantian, a shadow flashed, and a brand new, almost intact 5 elements disc gradually floated up. A look of disbelief and ecstasy flashed across Lu Chen's face. But then he was startled. On the 5 elements disc, everything was like a newborn baby. There seemed to be nothing. It was far from the outstanding talent he had in the past. At this moment, the 5 elements divine disc was completely barren. Only at the center of the disc, in the position of the earth element, was a yellow divine pillar that was the lightest in color. It was only about an inch tall, and it stood alone in the center of the disc. Among all the cultivators in the world, this was the situation of having the worst aptitude and the worst foundation of cultivating the Tao. Lu Chen was silent for a while, then he shook his head and smiled bitterly, but he didn't seem too disappointed. Just when he was about to leave, the 5 elements divine plate suddenly trembled, and actually flipped over. The entire plate was flipped over. Lu Chen's face suddenly froze. The other side of the 5 elements divine disc, the other side of the 5 elements divine disc that no one had ever heard of before, was completely empty. Apart from a vast expanse of black, not even a blade of grass could be seen. In the center of this strange black divine disc, a tiny black flame was silently burning in the center of the divine disc. It was like the grin of a devil, slowly opening its mouth full of malicious fangs at Lu Chen. What the hell is this weather? A curse came from the tavern. Old Ma was sitting in his own tavern, wearing only a pair of underpants. His upper body was bare, revealing his white fat. He held a towel in his hand and kept wiping his face, wiping away the beads of sweat that kept oozing out. His mouth was also constantly muttering. Sitting opposite him, Lu Chen also looked a little listless. He lazily glanced at the fat man, frowned, and said with a look of disgust, "Is there anyone who does business like you? Dressed like this in broad daylight, who would dare to come and drink?" Old Ma snorted and said, "In this kind of damned weather, even cicadas can be roasted on such a hot day. Who would come here to drink?" Lu Chen didn't deny it, but didn't refute him. He just looked at the glass of wine on the table in front of him. Today's weather had become a little strange since the beginning of summer. It was much hotter than in previous years. According to the elders in the village, it had not been such a hot summer in at least 30 years. Perhaps something was going to happen when the weather changed. This was the long-winded words of those old men who pretended to be mysterious. But obviously, no one believed this kind of baseless words, and there was indeed no other abnormality except for a little hotter. Lu Chen opened his mouth and yawned. He leaned against the wall and slightly narrowed his eyes, looking a little sleepy. Old Ma wiped his sweat again, and then looked at Lu Chen with some envy, who didn't sweat at all on such a hot day. After a moment, he suddenly frowned and came over. Lu Chen immediately opened his eyes and said, "What are you doing?" Old Ma looked at him and whispered, "Young man, I feel that your body seems to be very weak. Did you overdo it? Listen to my advice. Young people should take care of their body, don't wait." Before he could finish his words, Old Ma leaped backward and dodged a black foot from under the table with an agility that did not match his figure at all. He laughed and said, hurry up, you have a guilty conscience." "Guilty my ass." Lu Chen unhappily rolled his eyes at him. Old Ma laughed and used a towel to wipe his face. He walked back and sat down, and then casually said, "Speaking of this, I feel that you haven't been looking for Ding Dang recently?" Lu Chen coldly laughed and said, "I'm tired of playing, I don't want to play anymore, okay?" Sit. Old Ma grinned and then raised his head to look at the big sun outside. His face became dejected and he muttered, "Why is the weather so hot?" Lu Chen drank a mouthful of wine and was silent for a moment. He suddenly said, "That's right, that Li Ji who was accepted into the Thousand Autumns sect a few days ago, how is he doing?" Old Ma snorted and said, "It's not like I know everything. What does the cultivation sect's matters have to do with this village?" Lu Chen laughed and only looked at Old Ma. Old Ma's mouth twitched, then he lightly said, "That bastard's talent is really not bad. I heard that after he entered the sect, he quickly won the favor of one of the Thousand Autumns sect's elders and is prepared to accept him as a disciple. His future is bright." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Sounds good." Old Ma said, "A sparrow flying on a branch turns into a phoenix." Lu Chen said, "Then has he ever returned to Qingshuteng village?" Old Ma laughed and said, "Of course not. With his current status, who cares about this broken village?" Lu Chen thought about it and said, "You're right." Boom. Suddenly, a loud noise came from outside the tavern like a bolt from the blue. Moreover, the sound seemed to have come from the sky above the village. Lu Chen and Old Ma were both shocked. They looked at each other, then stood up and ran out of the tavern at the same time. At the same time, when they ran out of the gate, they saw many people in the surrounding houses running out as well. Obviously, they were all alarmed by the sudden loud noise. At this moment, many people in Qingshuteng village looked up at the same time. The sky was clear and the sun was high in the sky. There were no clouds in the sky and it looked like a hot day. Not to mention the usual dark clouds during thunder, there were not even a few white clouds. What was going on? Chapter 34. Just when everyone was astonished, someone suddenly cried out in surprise and pointed to a certain place in the sky. Sure enough, a black dot suddenly appeared high up in the sky in that direction, and it descended rapidly. Not long after, it vaguely seemed to be a human figure. At this moment, everyone was instantly in an uproar, and exclamations rose and fell. At the entrance of the tavern, Old Ma and Lu Chen's expressions changed slightly, and they glanced at each other in unison. Old Ma whispered, "A cultivator?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He nodded and whispered, "It should be." He lost control of his flight and fell. Old Ma clenched his teeth and his expression became a bit more serious. Everyone in the cultivation world knew that to be able to fly, one had to be at least at the initial stage of the foundation realm. In a cultivation sect like the Thousand Years sect, a foundation realm cultivator was the strongest. The speed of the black shadow falling from the sky became faster and faster, and it even brought with it a sharp whistling sound. The direction of the falling shadow was also falling towards the village. For a moment, everyone was in an uproar, and they all retreated, getting as far away from the falling shadow as possible. Not long after, a black shadow descended from the sky. As countless people screamed in shock, a loud bang rang out as it smashed into a house, creating a large hole in the roof. Dust immediately filled the air, and it felt like even the ground under its feet was trembling. The scene was so horrifying that even though everyone was just watching, they couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines in this scorching hot weather. After a moment, everyone slowly surrounded the house. Lu Chen and Old Ma were also mixed in the crowd. The owner of the unlucky house was standing outside the house, dumbfounded. He looked like he wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Soon, everyone saw the figure through the open door. It looked like an old man in his 50s. His body was lying limply on the ground. Blood flowed out of his orifices and he looked like he was dead. It was unknown how many bones were broken in his body, but he looked very miserable. The timid villagers had already retreated in fear, while the braver ones turned pale. Some of them even started to retch. At this time, someone suddenly exclaimed, pointing at the corpse, This person's clothes, it's the uniform of the Thousand Autumns sect's immortal elder." Everyone was shocked and turned their heads to look. Sure enough, they found the person to be somewhat familiar. Immediately, another uproar broke out and they all retreated. Old Ma and Lu Chen followed the crowd and walked to the back. Old Ma looked around to make sure no one was around and said in a low voice, It's Elder Su Yunha from the Thousand Autumn Gate. Lu Chen raised his eyebrows slightly and glanced at him, wanting to say something but hesitating. Old Ma saw his expression and frowned. What's wrong? After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, he was already dead when he fell. The fatal wound was on his chest. His Taoist robe on his right shoulder was torn. Though it's covered by blood, there's a metal plate stuck there. It should be the pattern of a giant tree. At this point he paused. Old Ma's expression changed slightly. Lu Chen turned to look at Old Ma and said, it's the work of the demon sect of the Three Realms. It's probably revenge for what happened a few days ago. Old Ma gritted his teeth and suddenly spat. He cursed under his breath, a bunch of lunatics. Qingshitang village was near South Pine Mountain and was considered to be within the Thousand Autumn Gate's sphere of influence. Thus, the clothes on the dead man were quickly recognized. After another half a day, a large group of cultivators from the Thousand Autumn Gate arrived at Qingshitang village. The peace of the past was, of course, nowhere to be found. However, the village was not noisy at all. The reason was simple. In front of the stern-looking Thousand Autumn Gate cultivators, the atmosphere in Qingshitang village was solemn. There were Thousand Autumn Gate disciples guarding the front and back of the village. Most of the villagers were as quiet as cicadas in winter, not even daring to breathe too loudly. The area near the dead man had the most Thousand Autumn Gate cultivators and seemed to have the highest status there. From time to time, someone would come out from that area and summon a few villagers for questioning. At this moment, Old Ma finally put on some clothes and was no longer naked. He stood with Lu Chen in the distance and looked at the house. After watching for a while, Lu Chen quietly nudged Old Ma and whispered, I'm afraid the Thousand Autumn Gate is going to be furious. Old Ma shrugged and said, of course. Su Yunha is at the peak of the foundational realm and is one of the two people with the highest cultivation in the gate. Aside from the gate leader, he is the next highest. The devil cult is really ruthless this time. It's equivalent to losing at least 30% of the Thousand Autumn Gate strength. Lu Chen shook his head without much expression on his face. Old Ma looked at him and lowered his voice. It's rare for the devil cult to make such a big move. Lu Chen frowned and didn't say anything. After a while, he whispered, the pattern under the tree a few days ago, maybe it's for this? Old Ma thought about it and nodded. It should be, but this is good. At least it's not for you. Lu Chen raised his head and looked ahead. A few villagers had been brought out by the Thousand Autumn's clan disciples, but no more villagers were called over for questioning. It was probably because the villagers here all spoke the same words, and there was no need to ask any more questions. But at this moment, his eyes suddenly narrowed and he let out a sound of surprise. His eyes stared at a certain spot in the crowd. Old Ma followed his gaze and after a while, he was also startled. Outside one of the houses, there was a group of 7,000 or 8,000 Autumn's clan disciples. Among them, there was a handsome man. It was Li Ji. It had been a long time since they last saw each other, but this talented and extremely lucky young man did not seem to have changed at all. He was still as carefree and elegant as ever, and when he stood among a group of cultivators, he seemed to stand out from the crowd. Many villagers in the surroundings saw Li Ji and gasped in surprise. Obviously, everyone was very envious of him. This was especially so for some of the young women. Their eyes were practically shining as they stared at Li Ji. It was as if Li Ji turned around to look at them, they would be enchanted. Old Ma shook his head and smiled at Lu Chen. What a good appearance. I'm so envious. Lu Chen didn't reply. He stared at Li Ji for a while and then looked away. But at this time, from the corner of his eyes, he suddenly saw that in a secluded corner of the crowd, Miss Ding Dang was standing under a withered peach tree. She was looking at Li Ji from afar. Her eyes were bright and her face seemed to be shining with light. She was exceptionally beautiful. Chapter 35. By evening, Elder Su Yunha's remains had been moved away by the Thousand Autumn sect. However, the Thousand Autumn sect disciples who were guarding the village did not retreat. Instead, they searched the village carefully, but in the end, they did not find anyone suspicious. After all, everyone here was someone who had been here for many years. In the end, they had no choice but to retreat. Of course, this was not a trivial matter. One could imagine the huge waves that would be stirred up in Thousand Autumn sect. Because the demonic cult of the Three Realms, which had kept an unusually low profile for the past 10 years, had suddenly changed their ways and carried out such a violent vengeance. After Thousand Autumn sect reported this to the True Immortal League, what kind of undercurrents would flow in the middle of the righteous path? However, to the villagers of Qingshitang village, and to most of the ordinary villagers, this was something that was too far away. After the Thousand Autumn sect's men left, Qingshitang village quickly regained its peace. The only person who was still indignant was the unlucky owner of the house whose roof had been smashed. However, he did not dare to speak to the Thousand Autumn sect about this unexpected disaster, and in the end he could only let the matter rest. However, in the eyes of some people, there seemed to be some inconspicuous changes in this peaceful village. After all, it was not the same as before. Lu Chen's life seemed to be the same as most people's. There was no change. He still strolled around every day with a harmless smile on his face. He was like a young man who had hope in cultivation but was unwilling to endure hardship. He was ready to live out his life leisurely like this. He was kind and amiable to most of the people in Clearwater Pond. Everyone knew him and liked him. However, if one were to really think about it, it seemed like no one could really become close friends with him. Year after year, he maintained a distance between himself and most people, quietly living his life. Every time the sky turned dark, he would return to the lonely straw hut at the foot of the mountain alone. For some reason, Lu Chen did not dislike the darkness like most people did. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. Every time night came, lying in the straw hut was the time when he felt the most freedom. In the darkness, his thoughts would spread endlessly, and he would think of many things in the past. Perhaps he could do some secrets that others could not know about. That night, the reborn divine disk of 5 elements reappeared in his Dantian Sea of Qi. Even though this disk had relied on the last bit of water of life in that mysterious tree hole to be reborn, it looked exceptionally inferior. Even a sect like the Thousand Autumn sect would probably refuse to enter if they saw this kind of cultivation foundation under the immortal mirror. Even so, Lu Chen was still very happy if this 5 elements divine disk didn't have another side. As the disk silently turned, the black side was revealed again. After a period of adaptation and exploration, Lu Chen gradually understood what had happened in his Dantian. The black flame curse that had troubled him for 10 years seemed to have disappeared. It seemed like it had perished together with the life water. However, for some reason, the reborn 5 elements divine disk in his body, the foundation of a cultivator, had undergone a strange change. On the normal side of the disk, the 4 elemental pillars of metal, wood, water, and fire did not appear. Only the earth elemental pillar in the center had the lowest and shallowest pillar. This meant that although Lu Chen still had the body of a mortal, he once again had the foundation to cultivate. It was just that his innate talent was terrible, so he could only cultivate earth-type cultivation methods. Moreover, the speed of his cultivation of Dao techniques and divine abilities would be extremely slow. However, all of this was not too difficult for Lu Chen. Being able to regenerate the disk was the greatest gift to him. What surprised him was the other side of the disk, the black side. In this world, at least as far as he could remember, he had never heard of such a thing since ancient times. Firstly, the 5 elements divine disk had never had a positive or negative concept. Secondly, there had never been a black and empty 5 elements divine disk. In the darkness, he quietly looked at the black side of the 5 elements divine disk. He looked at the familiar little black flame in the center of the disk. Then, he held his breath and slowly tried to activate that ball of flame. His divine sense was like a rope, slowly approaching that small cluster of black flames. In the darkness that no one knew about, in the silence, at a certain moment, his eyes suddenly opened. There was no pain or emotion, but in his calm and solemn gaze, there seemed to be 2 balls of dark flames flashing in his eye sockets. It was the height of summer in July, and the weather was getting hotter and hotter. However, because there was a clear stream that seemed to never dry up flowing through the village, the people of Qingshatang village were still living a more comfortable life than other places. One day when it was close to the end of the month, someone suddenly knocked on Lu Chen's straw hut. He opened the door and saw Ding Dang standing outside. Under the sunlight, she was still as beautiful as ever. Even though her face was a little red from the heat and there were a few drops of sweat on her forehead, she smiled when she saw Lu Chen and waved her hand to greet him. Lu Chen smiled and let her in. He said, "Why did you think of looking for me? What's the matter?" Ding Dang seemed to be in a good mood and very happy, as if something good had happened. She said to Lu Chen, "Can you do me a favor?" Lu Chen looked at her, and Ding Dong's face suddenly turned red, as if she had thought of something. Embarrassed, she smiled awkwardly and said, I still haven't collected enough spirit stones. Can I pay you back after a while?" Lu Chen indifferently waved his hands and said, "That's not a problem. I'm not in a rush to use the money. Speak, why are you looking for me today?" Ding Dang said, "Bring me to the Dragon Lake behind the mountain." "Dragon Lake?" "Yes." Ding Dang nodded her head vigorously and then happily smiled. "Why are you going to the Dragon Lake?" Lu Chen was a little flabbergasted and said, "The mountain is high and the road is long. The mountain path is not easy to walk and usually I don't see a shadow of a person. Why are you going there?" Ding Dang smiled. The joy in her eyes seemed to be unable to be suppressed. She looked like a proud hen that had just laid an egg and couldn't help but want to show off. But in the end, she seemed to be able to endure it. However, the smile in her eyes was like rippling water. She gently said to Lu Chen, "I heard that the scenery there is very good, so I wanted to go and take a look." She spread her hands and said helplessly, "I've been in Qingshatang village for a few years and have never been to this tea mountain. I heard that the mountain path is like a maze. I thought about it and only you can help me." Chapter 36. Lu Chen stared at the girl in front of him. Under the morning light, her snow-white skin and slightly red cheeks made her seem like a peach blossom that had bloomed in this world. She was charming and enchanting, emitting a dazzling radiance. After a moment, he nodded and said, "Okay, I will bring you there." Ding Dang cheered, smiling as she pulled on Lu Chen's sleeves, her eyes emitting a bright and amiable light, smiling, "Many thanks, I knew, you are a good person." Lu Chen smiled, declining to comment, and said, "The Dragon Lake is in the west of Tea Mountain. We will need at least 4 hours to walk there. Do you want to prepare a bit, or do you want to leave now?" Ding Dang clenched her fist, looking very excited. Her mood was anxious, and said, "Let's go now." Tea Mountain was not a towering mountain. Looking at it from the foot of the mountain was ordinary, but as the saying goes, looking at the mountain will cause the horse to run to death. Once truly walking up the mountain, the feeling was completely different. Especially the walking Lu Chen and Ding Dang, both were not cultivators, and were no different from ordinary mortals, so walking up the mountain was even more strenuous. Between the two, Lu Chen's physique was clearly much stronger than Ding Dong's. Along the way he walked, most of the time it was very easy, adding on to the fact that he was very familiar with the paths of Tea Mountain, bringing Ding Dang through the countless crisscrossing paths like a maze, his demeanor calm and at ease. On the other hand, although Ding Dang was full of energy at the start, not even half an hour later, her face gradually became pale, beads of sweat flowed down her face, and her breathing gradually became rough. She looked as if she had never done any heavy work before, nor did she have the appearance of someone who had walked long distances. Walking like this for a while, Lu Chen saw that Ding Dang could not hold on any longer, and could only stop to let her rest for a while. Ding Dang did not say anything, directly found a rock by the side of the mountain path, and sat down, gasping for breath, looking as if her whole body was about to go limp. Lu Chen shook his head and said to her, "You can't walk like this, why don't you go back first?" Although Ding Dong's face was pale white, but for some reason, she was extremely determined. She firmly shook her head and said, "No need, I will be fine after resting for a while." Lu Chen shrugged and stopped talking. The two of them rested for the time it took to drink a cup of tea before Ding Dang stood up and said to Lu Chen, "Let's go." The two of them continued to walk forward. The mountain breeze blew, and the tea trees that covered the mountains and plains rustled, like a green ocean. Ding Dong's stamina was only at this level, and for the rest of the journey, she would be so tired that she would not be able to move. Lu Chen could only stop to let her recover her stamina, and like this, time was wasted. According to Lu Chen's original plan, it would take about 4 hours to reach the Dragon Lake, but like this, the two of them spent more than half a day before they saw the calm lake at the top of the mountain. Although it took a lot of time, Lu Chen seemed to be extremely patient, and from start to finish, he did not show any impatience towards Ding Dang. On the contrary, Ding Dang was a little embarrassed, and said, "Sorry," to Lu Chen a few times, but was always laughed off by Lu Chen. But Lu Chen was also a little surprised that Ding Dang was able to persevere and walk all the way to the Dragon Lake, and had a whole new level of respect for this girl. When they walked to the side of the Dragon Lake, he pointed to the calm surface of the water, and said to Ding Dang, "This is the Dragon Lake." Ding Dang walked 2 steps forward, only to feel a cool breeze blowing over, bringing with it a moist and gentle aura, causing her to take a deep breath, and her face revealed a satisfied and happy expression. She still wanted to walk forward, but was suddenly pulled back by Lu Chen. Ding Dang was shocked and turned her head. "What's wrong?" Lu Chen looked at the distant Dragon Lake and said, "Don't get too close to the lake." Ding Dang asked, "Why?" Lu Chen said, "I heard people say that there seems to be a strange fish in the Dragon Lake. Its body is rather big, and it's a little strange. Maybe it will hurt people." Ding Dong's eyes widened and said, "What, you've seen it before?" Lu Chen shook his head and said, "I heard people say it, I've come here a few times, but I've never seen it before." Ding Dang could not help but laugh and said, "Then you still believe it?" Lu Chen laughed and shrugged his shoulders and said, "Who knows, anyways you can see the scenery from afar, as long as you don't get too close to the lake, it'll be fine." Ding Dang nodded her head, and then looked at Lu Chen and said, "Lu Chen, thank you for bringing me up, I'll be fine by myself, you can go back first." Lu Chen was startled and said in shock, "What? Then what will you do when you go back?" Ding Dang waved her hands and said with a smile, "I'm not a child, I'll walk the way back myself. Right now I just want to stay here alone for a while, you can go back first." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and then raised his head to look at the sky, and said, "It's already getting late, when you go down the mountain alone, it will most likely be dark, and at that time the mountain path will be even harder to walk. Can you really do it?" Ding Dang hesitated for a moment, but her expression was still resolute, and heavily nodded her head and said, "I'll be fine, you don't have to worry, I just want to stay here alone for a while." Lu Chen looked at her for a moment, and then did not say anything, and only nodded his head, and said, "All right then, you be careful." With that, he turned around and walked back the way he came. Ding Dang looked at his back figure walking away, and a complicated expression flitted across her face. It seemed to be a bit gentle, but also seemed to be a bit apologetic, but very quickly she still turned around, and once again looked at the calm lake. Just at this time, footsteps suddenly sounded out from behind her. Ding Dang turned around to look, and was immediately startled. It was Lu Chen who had returned. She saw Lu Chen walk over with large strides, and in his hand was an object, and stuffed it into Ding Dong's hands. Ding Dang lowered her head to look, and saw that it was a torch, and then she heard Lu Chen lightly say, "When you go down the mountain, if it's dark and you don't know the way, then break a few pieces of firewood to use as a torch, and then wave it towards the foot of the mountain. If you're lucky, I'll see you and come up the mountain to pick you up, but if I forget about this matter, or fall asleep, then you can only blame your own bad luck." Ding Dong's slender white fingers gently clenched, holding onto the torch in her palm. She then raised her head to look at Lu Chen, her eyes as clear as water. After a moment she suddenly smiled sweetly, nodded and said, "All right." Lu Chen laughed and turned around, not looking back, and not long after, he disappeared at the end of the mountain path. Ding Dang looked at the man's disappearing figure, a light flashed in her eyes, and no one knew what she was thinking about. Chapter 37. However, just as Lu Chen left, Ding Dang seemed to have sensed something. She turned towards the direction of the Dragon Lake and saw a figure appear from behind a large rock by the lakeside. Ding Dong's lips curled into a joyful smile. She tucked the fire lighter into her bosom and strode towards that direction. Tea Mountain and Qingshitang Village were just inconspicuous villages under the influence of the Qianqiu sect in South Pine Mountain. The Qianqiu sect itself was actually just an inconspicuous small sect in the incomparably powerful cultivation world of Middle-earth. On the vast and boundless Middle-earth, there were billions of living beings, countless powerful cultivation sects and cultivators, just like the stars in the night sky. In the current human cultivation world, Zhengxianmeng was fully deserving of the title of #1 power in the world. This was because it was not just a single sect. In fact, Zhengxianmeng was an alliance of hundreds and thousands of powerful cultivation sections. As long as one was famous in Middle-earth, their strength could be seen on the stage. Other than heretical existences like the Three Realms Divine Sect, the rest were almost all members of Zhengxianmeng. This huge organization had a very long history. In the long years, this special and huge organization had formed a foundation that was different from all the other cultivation sects, and that was the Immortal City. Most of the cultivation sects in the world, no matter big or small, were like the Thousand Autumns sect. They occupied a blessed land for their disciples to cultivate, and then naturally developed a city at the foot of the mountain next to the spiritual land. However, the true Immortal Alliance did not do so. This organization directly built a huge city on the most fertile and vast land of the Middle-earth, the Four Rivers Plain. After many years of expansion and repair, the Immortal City was already the most prosperous and powerful city in Middle-earth. It was also the most desirable city. All of the important sects of Zhengxianmeng were also located in this city. In the huge and ancient city, there were countless people living, bustling with activity, coming and going. Between the intersection of light and darkness, there were countless sorrows and joys of separation and reunion. There was light and there was darkness. It was like the sun rising and setting, an endless cycle of reincarnation. Inside the huge city, there was an extremely secretive place. It looked like a secret room, but it was also very spacious. There was a large round table in the room. The center of the table was empty, and a ball of flame was burning on it. The flame swayed silently, but if one looked closely, they would find that under the light of the flame, there was a pile of strange bones. They looked like beasts, but not beasts. They looked ferocious and terrifying, and even looked a little like the faces of evil spirits in ancient legends. Apart from that, there was only a lone figure sitting on a high-backed iron chair at the big round table with 11 seats in the room. It was a person shrouded in a black and red robe. There was also a hooded cloak on his back, covering his hair and neck. In front of his face, he even wore a golden mask. In other words, other than a pair of eyes, this person did not reveal a single inch of skin. The golden mask was carved with the face of a terrifying evil spirit. It looked a little like the burning bones at the center of the table, and it also added a gloomy aura to the figure. The entire secret room was silent. This mysterious masked man just sat there quietly, staring at the burning ball of flame. He did not move for a long time. The fire burned fiercely, and it was reflected in his pupils, as if there were two balls of flame burning in the depths of his eyes. After an unknown amount of time, suddenly, a soft sound came from a corner of the secret room. Then, a door appeared from the shadows, and a person pushed the door open and walked in. It was a man who looked to be in his 30s. His face was ordinary, and he looked like the kind of person that could be seen on the streets every day. Even his clothes were very ordinary, and he would not attract anyone's attention. The man's eyes swept around the secret room, and soon fell on the mysterious figure beside the strange round table. His face tightened, and there was a hint of nervousness in the depths of his eyes. But his expression did not change much. He quickly walked over, and with a table between them, he bowed respectfully. "Chen, he greets the elder." The head of the man wearing the golden evil spirit mask moved slightly, and then he looked at him. After a moment, a strange voice sounded. It was hoarse and low, and it sounded like metal and stone crisscrossing. For a moment, it was impossible to tell whether it was a man or a woman. He only felt a dull pain in his eardrums. How was the interrogation? Chen, he took a deep breath, and his head was slightly lowered. That guy couldn't withstand the punishment, and he's already dead. But from what he said before he died, he should not know Hei Lang of the past. The flame in the secret room suddenly sprang up, like a silent and terrible evil spirit, and suddenly roared. It was hair-raising. A suffocating silence suddenly descended upon this dark secret chamber. The man named Qin He stood there like a javelin, his eyes looking down at his nose looking down at his heart, not even daring to breathe loudly. After a while, the burning flame gradually calmed down, and the golden evil spirit mask raised its head again. The strange and hoarse voice sounded again. Almost all the fish that escaped the net in the Battle of the Barren Valley have been investigated, and there is still nothing. What do you plan to do next? Chen He was silent for a moment, and then said, after the disaster 10 years ago, the traitor disappeared without a trace. Although we have been trying hard to track him down, every time we find a clue, it is either cut off by others, or it alarmed some forces in Zhengxianmeng, and they often backfire on us. From this, we can see that there is an extremely powerful force in Zhengxianmeng that is protecting the traitor. Behind the golden evil spirit mask, there seemed to be a cold snort full of hatred and viciousness. Go on. Chen He said in a low voice, I think that the traitor is not in the celestial city now. Perhaps he is hidden by some big shot in some corner of the world, or even in some random small sect, pretending to be a harmless nobody to humans and animals, so that he can avoid being hunted by us. There was no reply from behind the mask. Chen He paused for a moment, then said, so in my opinion, maybe we should change to another method. What is it? The golden mask moved slightly, as if it was a little moved. In the past 10 years, all kinds of signs show that Zhengxianmeng is inextricably linked to the Battle of the Barren Valley. So if we want to find the traitor, Hei Lang, we should also put more effort into Zhengxianmeng. Previously, it was too difficult to find a way among the many cultivation sections. Chapter 38. The golden-masked man was silent for a while, then nodded slowly and said, what you said makes some sense. However, over the years, there have been spies lurking in Zhengxianmeng to investigate this matter, but they have not found anything. Do you have any new ideas? Chen He shook his head and said, this kind of thing is the same. We can only investigate carefully and trace every little bit of the past. The Floating Clouds Division of the True Immortal Alliance has always protected those shadows whose identities and origins are extremely secretive. We don't know how many secrets are hidden within it, and it has also been the focus of our investigation for many years. It's just that the results have not been obvious all these years. At this point, Chen He paused for a while, then his eyes flashed and he said, but I have an idea that might be helpful. Say it. In the past, we have always tried our best to track down those shadows, whose identities and origins are very mysterious, but it often takes twice the effort for half the result. However, these days I have been secretly thinking, maybe we can change our idea and start from those who come into contact with the shadows? The golden-masked man suddenly raised his head. Obviously, this sentence had aroused his interest. Chen He immediately noticed this, and a hint of joy flashed in his eyes, but his expression did not change. He continued to say, Zhengxianmeng has always attached great importance to the safety of the shadows, and the protection is extremely tight. However, people who come into contact with the shadows, such as inspectors, surveillance, and other people, although they also have their own ways of keeping secrets, are often in the open, such as the personal disciples of the major sections. So, if we start from these people and follow the clues, very good. Let's do this. A shout directly interrupted Chen He's words. Chen He was not angry, but happy. He quickly bowed and said, yes, I will obey. The golden-masked man slowly stood up, his eyes staring at the terrifying skeletons in the fire in front of him. Suddenly, he let out a low roar, like the roar of an evil spirit, which made people tremble with fear. A sound of hatred came from behind the mask, and he said coldly, the great foundation of the divine sect, and the lives of the 3 elders, should have been the most prosperous situation in the past 500 years, but it was all destroyed in the hands of that traitor. If this fiend doesn't die, how can our god sect live? As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly waved one of his arms, and with a boom, a ball of flames rose up, the fire blazed as if it wanted to swallow the world, and in the roaring flames, that voice also seemed to be burning, like metal striking stone, like a hoarse roar, shouting and cursing towards the darkness. Crush the bones and scatter the ashes. Soul extraction and soul refining. Let him die. Night fell as usual. The strange and mournful wails of ghosts and the wind once again spread throughout the tea mountain. In the darkness of the night, Lu Chen stood outside the hut and glanced at the tea mountain. All he saw was silence and deep. The darkness was as thick as an ink-smeared painting. He stood there expressionlessly for a moment, then walked back to the hut, lay down on the bed, closed his eyes, and fell asleep without a sound. The next time he saw Ding Dang, it was already 2 days later. At that time it was morning. Ding Dang was walking by a clear stream in the village. Her beautiful appearance was like the most beautiful peach blossom, dazzling, and in this season where the peach blossoms had already withered, she was still in full bloom, attracting the gazes of countless people in the village. But she did not care about the surrounding gazes. Her eyes were so bright, as if she was standing on the clouds, disdaining the dust, and also as if she was a person with a different fate. Even the people who greeted her rarely paid attention. She kept smiling, but did not show her smile to anyone. She was happy from the bottom of her heart, but only wanted to let herself be happy, and was not willing to give even a little bit to the people beside her. Until she saw Lu Chen standing at the entrance of the small wine shop. Ding Dang stopped for the first time. A trace of hesitation flashed across her face, and then she warmly smiled at Lu Chen from afar. Like a peach blossom in the spring wind, tender and beautiful, but also seemed to have a bit of reserved nobility, causing people to not dare to approach. Lu Chen returned a smile, nodded to her, and then turned to walk into the small wine shop. Old Ma sat at the table. The wine shop was still not doing well, so his face did not look good. Lu Chen walked to his side, sat down, and asked with a smile, "What is it?" Old Ma glanced at him and said unhappily, "You already know the answer, but still ask." Lu Chen laughed. "You are not really relying on this wine shop to make a living. Why are you looking at it so seriously?" Old Ma snorted, went to the counter to get a jug of wine, and threw it to him, then said in a low voice, "The matter with Su Yunhe from the Thousand Autumns sect has already been spread back to Zhengxianming. I heard that the higher-ups are furious and are investigating this matter." Lu Chen poured a cup of wine, thought for a moment, and said, "This matter is indeed a bit over the line, but it is also a bit strange. At least for more than 10 years, the Three Realms Divine Sect has not done something so out of line." Old Ma shrugged and said, "Maybe these years they have been suppressed too much, or maybe there is a new figure in the evil sect, and in order to establish their power, they killed the chicken to scare the monkey or something." As he spoke, he looked at Lu Chen and said, "Hey, tell me, why is it that the evil sect, this broken thing, how many times have they been beaten and destroyed, yet they are able to survive every time, dying like an unkillable bug?" Lu Chen was silent. After a while, his voice suddenly became a bit lower, and he said, "Maybe it is because the people in there are especially simple-minded, believing in some things to the point that even we can't understand." Old Ma's expression changed slightly, looked at Lu Chen's expression and then coughed, but changed the topic and said, "Oh yes, there is news from old Lu. He has already handed over all the matters at Immortal City, and will officially retire in a few days to go back to his original sect." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That is not bad. Old Lu is a good person." The two of them chatted casually in the tavern, just like they had done countless times in the past. In this ordinary mountain village, the two of them looked like ordinary people, staying in the most ordinary corner of the world, quietly living an ordinary and leisurely life. At noon, when Lu Chen was about to walk out of the door, he suddenly heard Old Ma suddenly said, "You seem to look good these days." Lu Chen's body paused for a moment, smiled, and did not say anything, and walked out. He walked all the way back to the hut at the foot of Tea Mountain, closed the door, and sat cross-legged on the bed. Not long after, in his Qi, the brand new but the most ordinary 5 elements divine discs slowly emerged. Lu Chen's face was calm, and he just quietly adjusted his breath. Gradually, A very subtle spiritual power appeared in his chi meridian and slowly flowed. Chapter 39. This wisp of aura was peaceful and upright. Although it was subtle, it carried a faint and heavy aura. It was pure earth spiritual power. The world was based on the 5 elements, and this was especially true for the cultivators of the central region. The attributes and aptitudes on the 5 elements divine disk almost limited their future cultivation direction and the approximate upper limit. This subtle earth spiritual power slowly traveled through his meridians, and then finally converged into his dantian's qi. For cultivators, no matter what realm they were in, such boring daily cultivation was the most basic foundation of cultivation. However, when Lu Chen inspected the results in his dantian, he still felt a little helpless. Perhaps after all, the black flame curse had caused too much damage to his body in the past 10 years. Now the foundation of this reborn 5 elements divine disk was really too poor. Although he could barely cultivate, whether it was the spiritual power he attracted or the speed of cultivation, his performance was quite poor. He was even worse than ordinary disciples. The only thing that looked good was probably the earth-type spiritual power that Lu Chen absorbed into his body. In terms of quality, it was relatively pure and thick. However, this was actually not strange. After all, there was only one earth-type divine pillar on his 5 elements divine disk, which meant that he could only absorb earth-type spiritual power. Of course, it was easy for it to be pure. In fact, as far as he knew, under normal circumstances, a person with such a foundation could not enter a cultivation sect to cultivate because his foundation was too poor. Generally speaking, ordinary cultivators would at least have 2 divine pillars. At the same time, the quality of the divine pillars could not be too bad. If one had 3 or 4 divine pillars, he would be a genius with an extremely high foundation. In the future, the upper limit of cultivation would also be very high. As for those who had all 5 divine pillars, they were rare geniuses in the world. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Lu Chen chuckled softly with a hint of self-mockery. However, he did not feel too sad. Perhaps to him, the current situation was already much better than before. Except the dark side. He silently put away the smile at the corner of his mouth and sat quietly in the lonely and silent thatched hut. The 5 elements divine disk in the sea of qi in his dantian slowly rotated and flipped. A touch of black quietly appeared, and then he saw the dark side. As soon as the wisp of black flame appeared, the blackness suddenly spread out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, Lu Chen's entire dantian and sea of energy transformed into a deep black sea. At this time, a strange, desolate killing intent faintly seeped out of his body. Lu Chen was awake. He was clear about the changes that had occurred in his body, although he still did not understand why such a strange change would occur in his body. He held his breath. After a while, he began to gently try to absorb the spiritual power of the outside world in this dark dantian, trying to see if he could cultivate. The spiritual power of the world was based on the 5 elements. This was an unshakable traditional belief in the central region for millions of years. Of the spiritual power of the 5 elements was the foundation that cultivators could absorb and cultivate. Therefore, Lu Chen did not feel anything. His attempts seemed to be useless. Under the darkness of the 5 elements divine disk, no aura could enter his body. Perhaps the ancient legends were right. Without the 5 elements divine pillar, he would not be able to absorb any 5 elements spiritual energy. Thus, it would be impossible for him to cultivate. Lu Chen tried for a long time, but after an entire hour, he still did not attract the slightest spiritual power. The black and cold 5 elements divine disk looked like a vicious curse, coldly mocking him. He sighed and dispersed his power. The 5 elements divine disk slowly turned over, the darkness receded, and the dantian sea of qi returned to its original appearance. So he became an ordinary person again. In the thatched hut, he sat quietly, as if he was lost in thought. Lu Chen walked out of his thatched hut and stretched his body. The mountain breeze brought a refreshing fragrance of tea down from the mountains. There was a faint, sweet fragrance in the air. His complexion seemed to be like what old Ma said that day. In the past few days, his complexion had begun to slowly improve. This change was not obvious, but there were some clues. Lu Chen stretched his body, and just as he was thinking about whether or not he should go to old Ma's place at the foot of the mountain to drink, he saw Ding Dong's figure. The girl walked over from the foot of the mountain and saw Lu Chen in front of his thatched hut. She stopped and smiled at him. Lu Chen smiled and nodded and said, "Where are you going?" Ding Dong pointed to the mountain and said, "I'm going to the Dragon Lake." Lu Chen was startled and said, "You're going alone?" Ding Dong nodded and said, "Didn't you bring me there once? I already know the way." Lu Chen looked at her and said, "The mountain road is hard to walk. Can you do it? Do you want me to accompany you?" Ding Dong smiled and said, "No need, I'm fine alone." Lu Chen said, "Why are you going there again? Walking up and down for an entire day, and you'll be half dead tired." Ding Dong said, "I'm going to see the scenery. The scenery of the Dragon Lake is very beautiful." In a short few days, she would climb the mountain to see the scenery of the lake. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, but in the end he did not say these words. In the end he only smiled and said, "Then you be careful. If it's late at night, it's better to light a torch and wave it a few times. When I see it, I'll come and find you." Ding Dong smiled sweetly. Her smile was bright and beautiful and said, "Many thanks, but I don't think there's a need." Saying that, she continued to walk up the mountain. After walking for a while, suddenly Lu Chen's voice came from behind and said, "That's right, Ding, I have something to ask you." Ding Dong turned her head and said, "What?" "The last time you went to the Dragon Lake, did you see any strange big fish?" Ding Dong shook her head and said with a smile, "No, the Dragon Lake has always been like that. There are no strange fish. Where did you hear such unreliable words from?" Lu Chen shrugged his shoulders and said with a smile, "So it's like that, then I was tricked by someone. It's fine, you can go." Ding Dong smiled at him and turned to continue walking. Lu Chen watched her figure gradually disappear into the distance, disappearing behind the mountain road and spirit tea trees. He then raised his head to look at the peak of the tea mountain, and his eyes seemed to have some thoughts. But then he lightly shook his head and turned to walk down the mountain road and walked towards the village below. Qingshui Creek was as clear as ever and as calm as before, adding on the beautiful bamboo on both sides. It was like a painting. Chapter 40. As Lu Chen walked over, he paused when he passed by the big locust tree. He first glanced at the roots, then walked to the big rock with a smile, and said to the old fisherman who was sitting there fishing, "Old Yu, how was today's harvest?" Old Yu's bamboo hat tilted, and he did not say a word. Lu Chen, who already knew the result, seemed to smile even more happily. He simply squatted down beside Old Yu and said, "I say, Old Yu, I don't think it's a good idea for you to just sit and wait like this." The old fisherman did not say a word, and even looked at him blankly. Lu Chen ignored him and said with a smile, "Why don't we go somewhere else to fish?" Old Yu frowned and said, "Where to fish?" Lu Chen pointed to the mountain in the distance and said with a smile, "Let's go to the Dragon Lake on the mountain. The water is deep there, and there's a lot of rain there. Maybe we'll have a chance to find the big fish you want." Old Yu shook his head blankly and said, "The mountain is too high, and why would the fish be on the mountain?" Lu Chen laughed and was about to say a few more words when suddenly there was a flash in the corner of his eye. He saw the fishing rod floating in the water shake violently. This time, both Lu Chen and Old Yu were shocked. After so long, no matter who it was, they had long gotten used to the feeling of never being able to catch a fish in the stream. Could it be that there was a change today? A moment later, Old Yu and Lu Chen sprang up and hurriedly put away the fishing rod. But after a moment, when the fishing line was put away, the two looked at the same time and saw that there was an ordinary fish only the size of a palm hanging on the hook. It was a little bigger than the small gray fish in the stream, big enough to bite the bait, but obviously not at the level of a big fish. The two of them looked at each other, and after a while, Old Yu sat down again in a daze. Lu Chen shrugged and grabbed the fish to unhook it. At the same time, he said, "Well, even this kind of fish is rare. Maybe there will be a chance in the future. He'd only spoken halfway when Lu Chen's voice suddenly stopped abruptly. Because right when his palm grabbed onto the body of the fish that had been pierced by the fishhook and was struggling with all its might yet was helpless, a strange aura suddenly appeared out of thin air, and it inexplicably carried traces of icy cold killing intent as it seeped into his meridians and meridians. Almost at the same time, Lu Chen felt a sudden tremor in his dantian. The divine disk of 5 elements suddenly appeared and flipped over. Dark aura swarmed in all directions, like the howling of evil ghosts, like the roar of darkness. The intense darkness enveloped everything. Pada! A muffled sound came from the side. Old Yu turned his head and saw that the small fish fell from Lu Chen's hand and fell heavily to the ground. The fish hook that had fallen out of the fish's mouth had somehow sunk into the fish's body, directly piercing the belly of the small fish. The small fish twisted on the ground a few times, quickly lost its strength, and then died. Old Yu frowned, glanced at Lu Chen and said, "This fish can't be eaten, why kill it? It's better to let it go." After saying that, he turned his head again, put the bait again, and then threw out the fishing rod to continue fishing. Lu Chen quietly stood behind the old fisherman and did not speak for a long time. After a long time, even when Old Yu was a little puzzled, he heard Lu Chen's voice suddenly become low and slow, saying, "You're right, I hit it too hard." Old Yu was a little puzzled, turned his head to look at Lu Chen, but saw that his face was as usual and his expression was calm, as if there was nothing wrong. Old Yu was too lazy to pay attention to him, and returned his gaze back to the water. Lu Chen stood for a while, then turned and left. He did not continue to walk into the village, even if this place was not far from Old Ma's little tavern. He turned in another direction, and once again walked in the direction of the tea mountain, walking all the way back to the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. Before entering, he glanced at the top of the tea mountain, and saw that there was not a single person on the peaceful mountain peak. At this moment, Ding Dang had already walked to who knows where. Perhaps she was trekking on a mountain path somewhere. When Lu Chen returned to the grass hut, he sat on the bed without saying a word, and then lowered his head in silent thought. He recalled everything that had just happened, little by little, and even every movement and feeling. He did not let go of any of it. His expression gradually became somewhat grave, and his gaze became sharper and brighter, as if he had faintly guessed something. After a while, he suddenly got up and walked towards the door. At the same time, on his right hand that was hanging by his side, his 5 fingers slightly curled, and a moment later, a black dagger silently slid out from his sleeve and fell into his hand. The sun was shining brightly outside, and the sky was clear. He slightly narrowed his eyes and looked around, and after a moment of silence, he walked towards the tea mountain. The mountain was very quiet, and other than the rustling sound of the mountain wind blowing through the tea trees, there were very few other sounds. Occasionally, there would be some bird cries from the depths of the forest in the distance. The tea mountain was not a majestic and vast mountain, but there were indeed quite a few wild animals on the mountain. It was just that for many years, the land in front of the mountain had been cleared by the human race to plant tea trees, and most of the birds and beasts had also left, avoiding the human race and moving to higher peaks or the back of the mountain. The black dagger in Lu Chen's hand was dull, as if it could not refract light at all. It was restrained and deep, but the edge was extremely thin. His hand was steady and calm, but for some reason, the dagger seemed to give off the illusion of trembling slightly. It was not fear, nor was it fear. Instead, it was the excitement of reuniting after a long time, as if they had not seen each other for many years. Even the dagger seemed to be yearning for something. The man's gaze swept around, and he slowly walked forward. Unknowingly, Lu Chen's face had become indifferent. About halfway up the mountain, the forest became quieter, but at this height, he felt that the surrounding birds' cries were getting louder, and on some of the tall trees, he could often see the figures of squirrels. Suddenly, the grass in front of him shook, and then a gray head appeared. It was a gray rabbit that was commonly seen in the nearby mountains. Its mouth kept moving as if it was chewing something, and at the same time, it looked around cautiously. Then, it saw Lu Chen standing on the mountain road not far away. It was a gentle man, his face calm, and even at that moment, There seemed to be a gentle smile hanging on the corner of his mouth. Obviously, the trace of coldness and sternness that had vaguely appeared on him not long ago had suddenly disappeared without a trace. Chapter 41. The gray rabbit shrank back a little, still looking at the person who suddenly appeared with full vigilance. However, the person didn't seem to have an obvious murderous aura, so the simple-minded rabbit didn't turn around and run. Its ears even pricked up, but soon, it felt that it should be further away from the dangerous human, so it retracted its head and prepared to turn around and run. The moment it lowered its head, the two long ears of the gray rabbit suddenly moved. At that moment, the little animal seemed to have suddenly heard something. It was a somewhat sharp and mournful sound of the wind breaking through the air. The gray rabbit jerked its head up, but it was too late. A chill like cold water enveloped it, and the last thing it saw was a cold and merciless black dagger piercing through the air. It didn't even make a sound as it easily pierced into the rabbit's chest. The gray rabbit fell into the grass. After a while, a trace of blood flowed out from the wild grass. Lu Chen walked over and squatted down beside the grass. He reached out and grabbed the dead rabbit from the grass. After taking a look, he reached out and pulled out the dagger. The black dagger directly pierced the gray rabbit's chest, killing it in one blow. Dark red blood flowed out as Lu Chen watched this scene silently. Suddenly, his body trembled. At that moment, his expression was extremely complicated and strange. There was both shock and astonishment, pleasant surprise, and comprehension. In the end, there was even a trace of disbelief and fear. A subtle black spiritual power once again quietly seeped into his body and slowly swam in his meridians like a black phantom. In his Dantian Sea of Qi, the dark five elements divine disk also surged, turning his Dantian into a dark world. At the center of this strange world was a small clump of slowly burning black flame. The wisp of black spiritual power swam in the meridians of his whole body and finally quietly entered his Dantian. Then, like a drop of water flowing into the sea, it was suddenly absorbed by an invisible force and directly integrated into the black flame. The black flames shuddered, wavered, and then calmed down. Nothing seemed to have changed. However, Lu Chen knew that he could feel that there was a slight difference. Even if the change was so slight that it could be ignored, he could still feel that the black fire had become slightly stronger after absorbing the black spiritual power. What exactly was that black spiritual power? Lu Chen lowered his head to look at the dead rabbit, and his face suddenly became abnormally pale. It had happened twice, in the Qingshui stream at the foot of the mountain and in the wild grass of the Tea Mountain. That little fish and this gray rabbit did not seem to have any similarities, but in reality, they had something in common. It was the moment of struggle before death. It was the moment when life was about to end and death was about to arrive. Lu Chen felt the terrifying black spirit force seep into his body. This kind of power, this kind of spiritual force, it was unheard of. It wasn't within the five elements, it vaguely lingered between life and death. It was like the aura of death, necromancy energy. Zhang Jiuping was 37 years old this year. He had a calm temperament and was serious in his work. He was born in the famous Tianluo sect, and his cultivation was not bad. He was entrusted by the sect to work in Zhengxianming. After passing through several halls, he came to Fuyunji, which was under the control of Xue Ying, the beloved subordinate of Lord Tianlan, and became an inspector. The patrol inspector was a good position, but it wasn't a good one at the same time. The good thing was that there wasn't too much fighting and killing. All they had to do was patrol the various places and contact some shadows who were extremely mysterious and secretive. Occasionally, they could earn some extra spirit stones. It was a safe and beneficial position. The reason why it wasn't a particularly good position was that the shadows, under the Floating Clouds Bureau, other than those who had snuck into the bureau to scam for food and drinks, were mostly weird people and monsters with strange personalities. Furthermore, they had to patrol the place all year round. Zhang Jiuping had been in this position for 3 years. In these 3 years, he had done a good job and almost never made any mistakes. Therefore, some big shots in Zhengxianming thought highly of him. They were planning to train him and promote him to do some more important things. He might even be in charge of an important position. However, in this life, luck was very mysterious and hard to predict. Just when he was about to make a name for himself after lying dormant for many years, something happened to Zhang Jiuping. Without any signs or clues, this outstanding inspector in Fuyunji in Zhengxianmeng died in the depths of an inconspicuous alley in Vermilion Bird Street in the north of the Immortal City. He died miserably. His body was stained with blood. When his body was found, it was quickly moved back to Fuyunji. Then, it could be roughly determined that the murderer should be from the divine sect of the Three Realms. This was because the murderer used a unique skill of the divine sect of the Three Realms. In addition, Zhang Jiuping's body was covered with wounds, but they were not caused by a fierce battle. According to some special people in Zhengxianmeng who came to see him, it might be a method of torture. It was hard to imagine who would dare to do such a cruel thing to the people of Zhengxianmeng, which had gathered tens of thousands of cultivation sects in the world. But if it was the divine sect of the Three Realms, everything seemed to make sense. What made the big shots in Zhengxianmeng even angrier was that this happened in the Immortal City, right under the nose of Zhengxianmeng. From this, it could be seen how rampant the divine sect of the Three Realms, which had been hidden for many years, suddenly became. All kinds of orders and investigations were sent out from Zhengxianmeng. The atmosphere in the huge Immortal City was a little tense. And in Fuyunji, the atmosphere was even more tense and gloomy. Old Lu came out of the room where the body was placed. There were already many people standing outside the room. Almost all of them were from Fuyunji. There were people from Fuyunji who were familiar with him who came over to ask. He took a deep breath. His face was very ugly, but he did not say anything. He just shook his head silently. After a while, he said in a low voice, "Very tragic." The surrounding people became silent. After a while, someone started to curse a few times. Old Lu sighed, looked up at the sky and said in a low voice, "How did old Zhang offend those lunatics from the demonic sect?" Another person who was also a Fuyunji inspector snorted coldly and said, "Who knows, those lunatics can't be judged by common sense." Speaking till here, he paused for a while, a trace of hesitation flashed across his face, and said, "Old Zhang is usually not very flamboyant. He shouldn't have become enemies with the demonic sect. Unless the demonic sect found him for something else?" Old Lu raised his head, and just at the same time, the others also looked over here. They looked at each other, their faces changed slightly at the same time, and then said in unison, "Shadow." Chapter 42. Old Lu took a deep breath and said, "Who is the evil sect looking for?" "Don't know, most of the identities of those shadows are hidden, even we are not sure." Old Lu pondered for a moment, then smiled bitterly and said, "If it is really to find a shadow, the evil sect actually did not hesitate to kill people in Immortal City. That shadow's identity and position must be incomparably important. Who exactly is it?" Someone at the side suddenly snorted and said, "Fuyunji has 72 patrols. The number of shadows, whether in the light or in the dark, is even more than that. How can it be so easy to find?" Old Lu was silent for a moment, suddenly said, "Old Zhang is usually very efficient. If I remember correctly, the shadows that he contacts is the one that among all the patrols?" No one around spoke. Old Lu smiled bitterly, looked around, then faintly said, "Maybe it is a coincidence, but if it is not, I'm afraid there is a mole here." Old Lu looked around, smiled, there was some bitterness in his smile, turned and walked away, muttering in a low voice, "The world will not be peaceful from now on. Ha!" A rabbit was thrown on the table, giving Old Ma a fright. Then he looked up and saw Lu Chen. Old Ma said, "What is it?" Lu Chen sat opposite him, said indifferently, "I have been drinking your wine all day. Today I went up the mountain to catch a wild rabbit, brought it over to go with your wine." Old Ma looked at Lu Chen suspiciously, said, "You are so good?" Lu Chen said, "I caught it along the way." Old Ma grabbed the wild rabbit by its ear, lifted it up to take a look, said, "There is no poison in this rabbit, right?" "No, I never do that kind of thing." Old Ma spat, looked at Lu Chen with disdain, said, "What can't you do?" The poison that you used in the past can at least kill the people in this village. Lu Chen said seriously, I did not say that I did not poison, what I mean is that there is no need to poison you, I never do that kind of stupid thing. Damn it. Old Ma kicked him, and Lu Chen dodged it calmly. Then Old Ma stood up with a grunt and carried the rabbit into the kitchen. An hour later, a large pot of steaming hot and fragrant red braised rabbit was placed on the table, and the fragrance it emitted caused one's mouth to water. It was rare for Lu Chen to praise Old Ma. Looks like your skills are pretty good. Old Ma wiped the sweat off his forehead and said proudly, Of course. Without calling for Lu Chen, he picked up a piece of rabbit meat with his chopsticks and threw it into his mouth, chewing it in big mouthfuls. Lu Chen smiled and picked up his chopsticks. Just as he was about to reach out, he suddenly heard Old Ma make an indistinct sound and then spit out the rabbit meat on the table. Lu Chen frowned and said, What's wrong? Could it be that a fatty like you can actually make something poisonous out of nothing? Old Ma smacked his lips a few times and said with a strange expression, This rabbit meat is a little strange. Why is it so sour? That shouldn't be the case, right? Lu Chen was startled and slowly put down the chopsticks in his hand. His gaze swept over the pot of rabbit meat and after a moment, he asked softly, Very sour? It's extremely sour, that's strange. Old Ma poured a cup of wine from the side and rinsed his mouth. Then he shook his head and said, What the hell? I've never eaten such sour rabbit meat in my life. Where did you catch it? Lu Chen looked at the rabbit meat quietly and said, I caught it from the tea mountain. Old Ma mumbled and paused for a moment before he couldn't help but try a piece. In the end, he immediately spat it out and scolded, This isn't a fucking wild rabbit, it's a sour rabbit. Hey, Lu Chen, why don't you try it? There was no expression on Lu Chen's face. After a while, he said, You've already tried it. Do you think I don't believe you? This rabbit meat can't be eaten anymore. Throw it away. After speaking, he stood up and walked out of the tavern. As he walked on the bluestone path, Lu Chen's expression looked a little ugly. His gaze was straight ahead and he silently walked back to his grass hut at the foot of the mountain. But just as he was about to enter the door, his body suddenly paused and he raised his head to look at the tea mountain. On that distant mountain peak, everything was as calm as usual. The wind blew through the tea trees and the mountain forest was silent. Apart from the direction of the back of the mountain, a wisp of black smoke suddenly floated up. There were no flames, no torches, and there was no one waving them. There was only a thin wisp of black smoke curling up. Lu Chen silently stood where he was, looking at the black smoke on the distant mountain. After a while, he opened the door and walked in. With a bang, he tightly closed the door behind him. It was as if he had shut the entire world behind him. The sound of the wind gradually grew, becoming somewhat mournful. The sky began to darken. The dark night was about to arrive. This night the wind was very strong. The cold wind blew past the tea mountain and the grass hut. That trace of coldness seemed to penetrate through the walls, giving people the illusion that it was not summer, but winter. The sound of the wind was especially mournful, like the mournful cry of a woman, echoing in the night. It was already dark outside. Lu Chen lay motionless on the bed in the grass hut. His eyes were closed, as if he had already fallen asleep. Even the cold wind outside could not wake him up. Suddenly, there was a faint sound mixed with the cold wind. In the dark world, it was like careful footsteps, slowly approaching the grass hut. In the wind, a few strands of thatch on the roof were blown up, shivering. A black shadow appeared from the darkness and walked towards the thatched hut. His footsteps were light and heavy, like a phantom in the night wind. When he reached the door of the hut, the black shadow suddenly stopped and stood still. The night wind blew bitterly, and the darkness seemed to cover the entire world. At this time, the tea mountain seemed to suddenly become abnormally sinister, terrifying, and tall. The shadow of the mountain was like a giant, about to crush down at any time. In the darkness, there seemed to be a sound of breathing that quickened, but also like a rapid heartbeat. In the silence, the black shadow seemed to raise a hand and touch the door. The night grew darker. Under the eaves of the grass hut, one could not see their fingers in front of them. They could only vaguely see that thick, ink-like shadow spreading over. Just as it was about to touch the door, suddenly, in the darkness, the door suddenly opened, and at the same time, there was a clear roar. The shadow in the darkness seemed to be startled and froze for a moment. In this split second, there seemed to be a large mass of dark shadow spewing out from the grass hut, covering the shadow outside. Chapter 43. A hard and cold hand, like a poisonous snake, instantly grabbed the neck of the black figure. With a sudden force, accompanied by a painful moan and cry, the person outside the hut was dragged into the hut and fell to the ground. At the same time, in the deepest part of the darkness, a dark dagger, with a cruel and bloodthirsty aura, stabbed towards the heart of the figure. Someone panted in the darkness, like a demon laughing, but also like despair and fear, yearning for blood, to extinguish the trembling in the nightmare. Ah! Someone cried out, with a cry and fear, trembling like withered grass in the wind. The tide of darkness surged, surging in this lonely hut. The sinister and ruthless black dagger pierced through the darkness, pierced through the wind, pierced through clothes, and directly stabbed towards her chest. His eyes were bright but cold. In the determination and killing intent, he saw the blurry outline of that face, and heard that cry. The darkness suddenly stopped, like the tide suddenly solidifying in the air, all sound disappeared, and at that moment, even blood seemed to stop flowing. The cold dagger pierced through her clothes and sank into her plump chest. If it went any deeper, it would be life and death. The world outside the house seemed to slowly return to normal, and it was as if he could hear the sound again. The wind was like a tide, whistling as it blew. That dagger still did not leave. She lay on the ground, her body cold, not daring to move. After an unknown amount of time, maybe it was just an instant, but it seemed as long as a lifetime, that snow-like coldness that pressed down on her chest, slowly lifted, and retreated into the darkness. Pada! A spark exploded, and then lit up the candles by the table. The dim yellow candlelight dispersed the darkness, adding a trace of warmth to this lonely hut. When the light landed on the ground, that figure turned her head, but it was Ding Dang. At this moment, she looked somewhat disheveled, her hair was messy, her clothes were untidy, and her face was frighteningly pale. She slowly sat up, looking at the man standing by the table, and the dagger still in his hand. That was a black, dull dagger. Lu Chen turned around and looked at her silently. After a while, he walked over and closed the door of the hut. The mournful howling of the wind seemed to have lessened by a lot, and the chill seemed to have been blocked outside. Ding Dong's complexion became slightly better as she slowly crawled up from the ground, but her gaze towards Lu Chen was still somewhat fearful. After a while, she said in a low voice, "You almost killed me just now." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then kept the black dagger, walked to the side and poured a bowl of water, passing it to Ding Dang, then calmly said, "You should not have thought of sneaking into my house at this time." Ding Dang slightly lowered her head, both hands hugging the bowl of water. She sat down on Lu Chen's bed and slowly sipped on it. Lu Chen walked to the table and pulled over a stool, sitting opposite Ding Dang. He did not say anything else, only sizing her up. Other than the previous fright, Ding Dang did not seem to have any other problems, but perhaps because she was a little tired, her complexion looked a little haggard. After a while, Ding Dang placed the bowl of water to the side and said, "I am too tired and am unable to walk down the mountain to the village, so I wanted to rest here for a while." Lu Chen looked at her, nodded his head and said, "Sure." There was a blanket on the bed, and the blanket was still slightly warm. When Ding Dang lay down, she would think that not long ago, it should have been Lu Chen lying here. This place was not as comfortable as the bedroom at home, but in this dark night, it was still a warm place that made people feel at ease. Lu Chen stood in front of the bed, covering her with the blanket. The two of them looked at each other, his eyes reflecting the light from the candlelight. Ding Dong's body slightly trembled under the blanket. It was a kind of faint trembling feeling, but after a while, Lu Chen turned around and walked to the table, blowing out the candle flame. The darkness surged, and his figure became indistinct. He walked to the side of the bed, and then lay down on the ground beside the bed. That night, they did not speak much, and for some reason, They did not talk about the usual joking and frivolous words, and were even more silent. In the darkness, who knows how long, suddenly Ding Dong's faint voice sounded out, "Are you asleep?" "Not yet." Lu Chen's voice came from the ground beside the bed. Ding Dong was silent for a while and then said, "Are you cold?" "Not bad, not cold. Don't you want to ask me why I am like this, or why I always want to go up the mountain?" This time Lu Chen did not reply. He was silent in the darkness for a while, and then said, "If you don't say, then I won't ask." Ding Dong once again became silent, and for a long period of time, there was no sound in the grass hut, but because it was too quiet, it was as if they could faintly hear each other's breathing, or maybe they could even hear their own heartbeats. Ding Dong slowly curled up under the bedding, her hands wrapped around her chest, as if she felt a little cold. After a while, she suddenly said in a soft voice, "I want to talk to you about something, okay?" Lu Chen, "Okay." Ding Dong, "I went up the mountain to meet someone at the Dragon Lake." Lu Chen, "Okay." Ding Dong, "That person is Li Ji." Lu Chen, "Ding Dong, the spirit stones I borrowed from you, along with my own savings, were all given to him so that he could have a chance to enter the Thousand Autumns Gate." Lu Chen, "Ding Dong, he and I have made a promise to marry each other. He said that his talent is extraordinary, and as long as he has the chance to see the immortal mirror, he will definitely be accepted into the Thousand Autumns Gate. When that time comes, he will come to take me up the mountain, and from then on, we will cultivate the great Tao together, and we will be immortals together. Lu Chen, you believe him? Ding Dong, yes. In the darkness, Lu Chen turned his body sideways, his gaze fixed on an unknown place in the darkness. After a while, he said softly, "You're tired, go to bed early." Ding Dong was silent for a moment, then said, "Okay." The Immortal City was a huge city, and it was the liveliest and most bustling place in the Middle Earth continent. Tens of millions of people lived in and around this magnificent city. Zheng Xianmeng was here, and it had been the ruler of this city for many years. It was the symbol of the Middle Earth continent's greatest power, but even with such a fearsome colossus as Zheng Xianmeng, in reality, it couldn't completely control this revered giant city. Fiyunji Zhang Jiuping's death caused a huge commotion in Zheng Xianmeng, so much so that a few terrifying true monarchs were enraged. But to this huge city, this matter didn't have much to do with most people. Chapter 44. The Three Realms Divine Sect had been on the decline for many years. Even if it still had some reputation, even if it could occasionally stir up some bad things, at least from the situation in the past 10 years, this sect was no longer on the stage. Hence, the tense and somber atmosphere was actually only within the true Immortal Alliance. In fact, most of it was only on the side of the Floating Clouds Agency. Of course, the order to investigate the Three Realms Divine Sect had already been issued by the higher-ups. Various forces had also started to move slowly. There were activities in the open and in the dark. However, at least on the surface, the Immortal City didn't seem to have changed much. At most, it was just a topic of conversation after a meal. The former inspector of Fiyunji, Old Lu, finally handed over all his responsibilities on this day. He could be considered to have completely retired from his post. His feelings were a little complicated. He was a little disappointed, but also a little happy. He was happy because being able to work in Zheng Xianmeng was the most desirable and best choice for most cultivators, especially the disciples of the small and medium-sized sections. Here, they had the opportunity to get better resources and better opportunities, as well as the respect that they usually couldn't get. On the other hand, he was disappointed because of the price of those things. Many times, they had to sweat, bleed, or even risk their lives. But after he retired, all of that would come to an end. Old Lu didn't know many people in Fiyunji, but he still had a few acquaintances. Therefore, on this day, everyone gathered together to drink for him. Unfortunately, the young man that he had high hopes for, Bianjia, had already left Immortal City a few days earlier due to his duties. Therefore, he couldn't send him on his last journey before he retired. Old Lu was a little regretful, but it was also a very enjoyable thing to drink and chat with his other old brothers in Fiyunji. He was almost at the end of his journey, and most of the time, he had already seen through things, so he didn't have to hold back when he spoke. After drinking too much, he even half smiled and half seriously said some words that he wouldn't normally dare to say to his immediate superior who came to visit him. That superior was a woman. She was usually stern and strict, but on this night, she just laughed it off and didn't take it to heart. On the contrary, the faces of the people around the table changed. They looked at old Lu as if they were looking at a monster, and no one spoke. Old Lu sensed something, but the alcohol got to his head and he couldn't react in time, so he didn't think about it anymore. When he slowly woke up, it was already the morning of the next day, and it was time for him to leave the immortal city. That morning, old Lu broke out in cold sweat as he sat on the bed, and then he packed his bag and ran away. He didn't dare to stay in the immortal city for a moment longer, and he didn't even care about his agreement with his old brothers to send him off. Fortunately, he didn't encounter any accidents on his way out of the city. It seemed that the woman with the nickname Black Widow wasn't angry for once. Old Lu felt lucky in his heart, but at the same time, he was wary of his own stupidity. He had been cautious all his life, but he actually did such a stupid thing before he passed away. As these thoughts crossed his mind, he walked out of the grand and majestic city gate of Immortal City and gradually walked away. On the bustling and crowded street outside the city, people came and went. Amidst the silence, amidst the hustle and bustle, a shrill cry suddenly came from afar. Many people did not even have time to react. However, there were also people who heard the voice and clearly repeated it when they investigated. On that morning, as usual, old Lu, who was rushing out of the city, suddenly disappeared, and the last cry he left behind was like this: "Blood Warbler." However, the ordinary people didn't know the truth. Zhengxianmeng Fuyunji, the beloved general under true Lord Tianlong, wielded great power in Fuyunji, and even in the enormous Zhengxianmeng, there was a famous leader, the Hall Master, who was a woman called Shui Ying, nicknamed Blood Warbler. At daybreak, Ding Dang and Lu Chen woke up. Without saying anything more, Ding Dang quickly left the place. Lu Chen sent her to the intersection and didn't continue down the mountain. He looked at the back of the woman who left in a hurry and remained silent. When she was on the mountain, did something happen? Why did she look so weak and helpless last night? Was she afraid of Lu Chen, afraid of death, or afraid of something else? After that, she didn't say anything, and Lu Chen didn't ask again. The days quickly calmed down again, or perhaps on the surface, these days never changed, forever repeating day after day. Ding Dang didn't come to find Lu Chen again. That night in the darkness, she used a slightly trembling voice to say those words, as if they were just murmurs in the darkness, quietly drifting in the wind. Lu Chen continued to live alone, occasionally going to the small tavern at the foot of the mountain to drink, but most of the time he stayed in his grass hut. Every day, he would try to recultivate on his own, but the aptitude of the 5 elements divine disc that he had been reborn with was a little too poor, making his path of cultivation extremely difficult. The spiritual power in his body was next to nothing, and he didn't make much progress with each day. However, Lu Chen didn't lose heart. On the contrary, he continued to persevere, and began to walk on this path that he had walked before. As for the dark side of the divine disc, after that night, he didn't touch it again. Because when he thought back to the situation in the darkness, Lu Chen clearly felt, at least at that moment, when the darkness was at its most turbulent, he faintly felt that he lost control of his own mind and body. And that black spiritual power from the 2 attempts was almost certain to be related to slaughter and death. Lu Chen didn't fear blood, nor did he fear the darkness. In his silent years, these 2 things had always accompanied him through those days. However, if it was spiritual energy that could only be obtained through killing and death, this kind of thing still exceeded the limits of Lu Chen's heart. Moreover, there was an unremarkable but important matter that made Lu Chen subconsciously keep a little distance from the divine disk of darkness. It was a pot of strange, sour rabbit meat. Old Lu died. The hot sun shone outside the house. Although it was a little cooler inside the pub, it wasn't much better. The sweat on Old Ma's head was still seeping out. He wiped it with a towel, half covering his face, and said in a flat tone to Lu Chen, How did he die? The day he left Immortal City, he disappeared outside the east gate of Immortal City. Someone heard shouting, but no one found him. When he was found again, Old Lu was already a corpse, thrown in the black pine forest outside the west gate. Even his corpse had been half-eaten by wild beasts. Lu Chen was silent for a while and asked, "Was it the devil cult?" Old Ma sighed and put down the towel in his hand. Then he said, "During this period of time, 2 patrol envoys of the Floating Clouds Division have died consecutively. Zhang Jiuping was definitely killed by the devil cult, but Old Lu can't be sure for now. For the time being, there are no traces of the devil cult on him." Chapter 45. Seeing that Old Ma was hesitant to speak, Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and said, "What's wrong?" Old Ma laughed bitterly and said, "This matter is quite..." It is said that on the day Old Ma disappeared, many people on the main road outside the Immortal City heard that exclamation at the same time, but what Old Lu shouted was not cursing the evil sect, he called out Hall Master Shue's name. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly and said in a low voice, "Shuang?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes. The atmosphere in the Immortal Alliance is a little tense and Fuyunji is also in chaos. As for Hall Master Shui, I heard that he has been in seclusion for a few days." Lu Chen thought for a while and shook his head. Although Shui Ying's temper is not good, she should not be a spy of the evil sect. Old Ma was a little surprised and looked at Lu Chen and said, "I remember that you have never met her before. How can you be so sure?" Lu Chen said indifferently, 10 years ago, she participated in the battle in the desolate valley." Old Ma became silent and after a while, he nodded and did not speak anymore. There was no need to talk about the treacherous situation in the Immortal City and the unfathomable dangers, but it seemed to be too far away and did not seem to affect the small mountain village thousands of miles away. The villagers of Qingshitang village were still living quietly, working hard for the illusory dream in most people's hearts. On the morning of the 6th of August, when Lu Chen was going down the mountain as usual, he once again met Ding Dang, who was walking up the mountain. It was different from when they met a few days ago. Lu Chen could tell that Ding Dang did not seem to be in a good condition today. Her appearance was still beautiful, but her expression seemed to be a little haggard. She was no longer in high spirits but seemed to have something on her mind. Even when Lu Chen brushed past her, she who had been slightly bowing her head did not notice. For some reason, Lu Chen did not call out to her and only silently watched the woman walk up the hill and walk alone towards the distant Dragon Lake at the top of the mountain. Wasn't that a huge gamble? Was the wager his entire life? The figure in the distance looked extremely fragile and lonely. After she disappeared into the forest, Lu Chen silently turned around and walked back to the village. But for some reason, that lonely figure still lingered in his heart when he walked into the tavern. There was always a strange feeling of unease that he couldn't get rid of. Old Ma saw him and quickly walked over. His face was solemn with a hint of nervousness. He closed the door and pulled Lu Chen to sit down. Lu Chen frowned and looked at the nervous fatty. "What's wrong?" Old Ma took a deep breath and lowered his voice. "Something's not right." A glint flickered in the depths of Lu Chen's eyes as he said, "Speak." Old Ma replied, "I've just received news that 3 people from the Fuyun Agency's shadow guards have died in succession during this period of time. They were all killed by someone." He raised his head and glanced at Lu Chen. There was a hint of dryness in his voice as he said in a low voice, "Among the people who died, one of them was the shadow that Zhang Jiuping was in charge of. The other 2 were contacted by Old Lu in the past few years." Lu Chen was silent. He sat at the table and did not speak. Old Ma looked at him for a while and said softly, "There's still no news that directly points to the 3 Realms Divine Sect as the culprit, but it's them. They would rather kill the wrong person than let them go." Lu Chen suddenly interrupted him. Old Ma paused for a moment. Then he gritted his teeth and said, "If that's the case, we can't just sit and wait for death. Before he finished, his voice suddenly lowered as if he thought of something. At the same time, Lu Chen also shook his head slightly and said, "There's something strange about Fuyunji. There's either a traitor or they're being watched. We can't look for them." Old Ma nodded slowly. His face gradually calmed down. He frowned for a moment and said, "You're right. I'll arrange this. Let's leave this place." Lucien asked, "How long?" Old Ma said, 3 days, 2 days at the earliest." Lucien was silent for a moment and said, "If we suddenly disappear, it'll mean that there's something strange here. It might attract the attention of the evil sex demons. I'm just a fugitive. What about you?" Old Ma snorted and said, "I'm fine. Didn't I survive a few years ago? Moreover, not many people in the Immortal Alliance know my background. There are at most 2 people." Lucien glanced at him and said, "Who is it?" Old Ma said, "Perfected Lord Tianlan and Hall Leader Shui." Lucien nodded and stood up. He said, "Arrange it as soon as possible." Old Ma said, "Okay." Walking out of the tavern, it was still sunny and hot outside. The quiet mountain village under the sun seemed especially peaceful and quiet. Lucien looked around. He had an inexplicable feeling in his heart. He had lived here for 10 years and knew everything here. Although the villagers here were not all good people and he was just acquainted with them, he still unexpectedly felt a trace of warmth when he looked at the village. However, he quickly swept this trace of emotion out of his mind. He turned around and walked towards the thatched hut. In that lonely house at the foot of the mountain, he also had some things to tidy up. Lucien's footsteps paused when he walked past the large pagoda tree. He glanced at the old fisherman who was fishing and smiled. In the end, he did not go up to say anything, and instead walked over. The cicadas screamed with all their might behind him, as if they were going crazy against the hot weather. When walking up the mountain path, Lucien looked up at the tea mountain. All these years, perhaps the only person who was really close to him was that woman. Unfortunately, she had bet on someone else. But that was good. No matter what, someone else had a better future than him. There was a bitter smile at the corner of his mouth, but in the next moment, his smile suddenly froze because at this moment, he suddenly saw somewhere on the peak of Tea Mountain in the distance, there was suddenly a flash of fiery light, and then after waving for a moment, it quickly disappeared. Was that a torch in the daytime? If this was a gamble, he had to bear the consequences himself. Lucien walked into his thatched hut and began to pack his things. However, as he walked around the hut, he picked up and put things down. After a while, he sat down on the side of the bed and sighed, thinking that he really had nothing to worry about. He sat silently for a while, his eyes calm but inadvertently at a loss, but he quickly calmed down. After a while, he suddenly stood up, opened the door, and walked out, walking towards the tea mountain. The spirit tea trees all over the mountain swayed in the wind. The green leaves were still full of life, as if they were not frightened by the scorching sun even in the height of summer. Chapter 46. Lucien walked on the mountain road and gradually climbed higher. The thatched hut behind him and the village at the foot of the mountain gradually became smaller. The stream that flowed through Qingshiteng village also looked like a long, thin snake. The tea mountain was very quiet. There were birds chirping and the sound of the wind, but it was still very quiet. There were many mountain roads, and from time to time there would be forks in front of him. Lucien would occasionally stop and think carefully, then look up at the top of the tea mountain, recalling the direction of the torch that suddenly appeared not long ago, and then continue to walk forward. About an hour later, he stopped on a mountain road that was close to the top of the mountain. About 10 feet in front of him, under a spirit tea tree, there was a withered branch that had fallen. It was charred black as if it had been burned. Lucien stared at the branch for a moment, then walked over and squatted down beside it. He picked it up and carefully examined it for a moment, then suddenly touched the charred end of the withered branch. There was still some residual warmth on the branch. He silently stood up and looked around, at the ground, the grass, and the forest. There were messy footprints, wild grass that had been stepped on, broken branches, and broken leaves. The mountain wind blew, and the mountain peak seemed to be a bit chilly. Lucien stood in the same place for a while, then continued to walk forward expressionlessly towards the back of the tea mountain in the direction of the west foot of the mountain peak. Splash! A burst of splashing sound suddenly came from the clear water stream, but it startled Lao Yu under the big locust tree. He looked up and saw that the fishing float in the stream was shaking violently. He was startled at first, then overjoyed, and with a cry of surprise, he hurriedly reeled in the line. But the fishing line was first taut, then suddenly pulled back violently. A strong force suddenly came, and after a muffled sound, the fishing line broke in the middle. Lao Yu involuntarily took 2 steps back, his heart sinking. Just as he was about to continue doing something, he saw a black shadow suddenly flash in the depths of the water, and in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. There was a burst of ripples on the stream, like wind blowing over the surface of the water, but soon it slowly calmed down. In the clear water, there was no longer any abnormality, it was exactly the same as before. The old fisherman growled angrily, stomping his feet and pounding his chest in frustration. At this moment he suddenly heard a voice behind him. Someone said with a gentle smile, "What a pity! That seems to be a big fish." Old Yu turned around and saw a young man standing under the large pagoda tree behind him. He was dressed in a long white robe and had delicate features. He held a folding fan in his hand, and there was a painting of mountains and rivers drawn on the surface of the fan. Even though it was a hot summer day, he still looked somewhat elegant and otherworldly. This young man's smile was very gentle, and he was also very good-looking. At first glance, he made people feel very comfortable and pleasing to the eye. After Old Yu saw this young man, his first impression was that this guy seemed to look better than Li Ji from a few days ago. However, he had never seen this person before. He didn't seem to be from Qingshitang village, and Old Yu wasn't someone who was good at socializing. He frowned and turned his head away without a word. He continued to pick up the fishing rod and reel the fishing line. The young man behind him wasn't in a hurry. He looked at Old Yu with a smile and said after a while, "Old sir, have you been fishing here for a long time?" Old Yu didn't want to answer, but the young man's attitude was too good. It made him feel a little apologetic, so he subconsciously agreed. The young man smiled and fanned himself twice. He looked at the sky and said, "Although it's quite uncomfortable on such a hot day, I heard that some fish are different when it's hot and will float to the surface. That's probably what happened just now." Old Yu was shocked. He turned around to look at him and said, "Is that true?" The young man smiled and closed his fan. He cupped his hands and said, "I only heard about it. I don't dare to guarantee it." Old Yu thought about it and nodded. "All right, I'll continue fishing." The young man nodded with a smile and didn't say anything. He just stood under the shade of the big locust tree, as if this was a leisurely life. Old Yu didn't have any aversion to it. After all, the young man didn't disturb him while he was fishing. It was just that when he occasionally looked around, he would suddenly notice that there were more figures in some corners and roads of the village in the distance. Those people's faces seemed a little unfamiliar. Unlike Lu Chen, who had nothing to worry about when the plump old ma packed his luggage in the back hall of his small tavern, he found that there seemed to be a lot of things that belonged to him, or rather, he wanted to take with him. He packed one thing after another and packed one bag after another until even he couldn't stand it anymore. He stared at the pile of luggage in the room and muttered with a depressed expression, "Forget it. If that guy sees this, I'm afraid he'll scold me to death." He shook his head with a look of regret and pain on his face. He sighed and kicked away a few bags of luggage. He picked up a few more and put them aside. After a while, there were only 3 bags left in the middle of the room. After that, old Ma stopped cleaning up. Instead, he walked to a wall and pushed open a cabinet. Then, his hand groped in the corner for a moment, and a secret door opened. A bulging bag was lying in this secret compartment. From time to time, there was a slight sound of impact, as if there were many small stones in it. Old Ma carefully lifted the bag with a satisfied expression. He touched it gently with his hand and hugged it hard. Then, he walked back to the middle of the room and stuffed it into the depths of one of the luggage. After doing this, Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief and showed a satisfied expression. He looked around and was about to leave the room. Suddenly, there were a few clear knocks on the door of the tavern in front of him. Knock, knock, knock. Accompanying the knocks was the gentle voice of a young man. He seemed to be smiling as he said, "Is anyone there?" Old Ma turned around and looked at the entrance of the tavern. He didn't know why, but he suddenly frowned. The sun shone down with thousands of golden rays. It was incomparably hot, but the water of the Dragon Lake behind Tea Mountain was still as calm as a mirror. It was like a beautiful gem embedded in the mountain. When people approached the lake, they would feel a trace of moisture and coolness that was rare in this hot weather. The mountain was green and the water was blue. The mountain peak was reflected in the water, and the lake and mountains were beautiful. Between the mountains and rivers, it was a peaceful place. However, at this moment, there was a burst of noise coming from the lakeside. Two figures stood by the lakeside, a man and a woman facing each other. Chapter 47. Behind Tea Mountain, Dragon Lake, lakeside. The man was handsome and the woman was beautiful. They were supposed to be a match made in heaven, but for some reason, they were glaring at each other, arguing about something. The woman was Ding Dang, and the man was Li Ji, who had joined the Thousand Autumns Gate a few days ago. At this moment, Ding Dang looked to be in a sorry state. Her clothes and one side of her sleeves had traces of being torn. Her hair was also a little messy. A strand of her hair was slightly slanted, falling onto her snow-white cheeks. On the other hand, Li Ji did not seem to have any abnormalities, but his eyebrows were furrowed, his face was filled with anger. He stared at Ding Dang, his mouth was filled with suppressed anger, and he roared, why do you have so many words? Didn't I already tell you many times? Welcoming you into the sect can't be rushed, it has to be done slowly. Ding Dang laughed coldly, her eyes as sharp as knives. She said hatefully, who do you think you're trying to fool? When you took my spirit stones, everything was agreed upon. As long as you joined the Thousand Autumns Gate, you would immediately welcome me into the sect and we would cultivate together. It's only been a few days and you're already going back on your word? Li Ji's face turned green and he said angrily, how can it be so easy? I'm not the only one in charge. What's more, Elder Su died a horrible death to the demonic sect not long ago. Now the entire sect is in a frenzy, and everyone is chasing the demonic sect's murderer. How can I bring this up? Ding Dong's expression didn't change, and she only laughed coldly. You make it sound so nice, but do you think I'm a country bumpkin? I've already asked around, and the Thousand Autumns Gate can't do anything about it. We can only report it to Zhengxianmeng and ask the Immortal Alliance to investigate. Now that the Thousand Autumns Gate has taken care of Elder Su's funeral matters, there are no other restrictions. Didn't your gate master just accept a new disciple a few days ago? Li Ji's expression froze, and he was speechless for a moment. Ding Dang bit her lips and stomped her foot. If you insist on refusing, then return the spirit stones to me and help me gather the remaining 1,000 spirit stones according to our original agreement. Let me take a trip to the immortal mirror. Whether I live or die, whether I become an immortal or a mortal, I will leave it to fate. Li Ji clenched his fists tightly, his face flushed red as he said, Where do I get so many spiritual stones now? Ding Dang stared at him for a long time before saying, This won't do, that won't do. Today you are the only one who has entered the immortal sect and cultivated the immortal Tao. Your future is bright, but I have to stay in this small village in the mountains and suffer the torment of others. Every day I look forward to seeing you, but it is hard for me to see you. Do you know how it feels? Saying the last sentence, Ding Dong's eyes were red, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Li Ji gritted his teeth and said, I said, this matter cannot be rushed. Give me some more time. Ding Dang rubbed her eyes. She did not know why, but when she looked at Li Ji, her expression slowly softened. Her eyes had a trace of mournful sorrow as she said in a low voice, Li Lang, my feelings for you, could it be that you really do not understand? Li Ji lowered his head and did not say a word. Ding Dang took a step forward and said, From the first time I saw you, I fell in love with you. From the moment you drew me those paintings, I wanted to be with you for the rest of my life. For you, I am willing to do anything. Do you know that? She sobbed softly and said, I do want to cultivate, but I want to be with you even more. The two of us will cultivate together in the future and be free and unfettered. We'll live forever and never grow old, and we'll be immortal companions. Is that okay? Okay. Saying that, she reached out and grabbed Li Ji's hand, hugging it to her chest, and looked at him with a sorrowful expression. Li Ji raised his head, and the expression on his face changed a few times. Hesitation, apprehension, joy, yearning, sadness, fear, and all sorts of other emotions flashed across his face in that short moment. On his palm, the warmth of the girl's body came, and the familiar feeling of soft skin. His expression suddenly became cold, and looking at Ding Dong's eyes, he said coldly, "How many men's hands have you held like this?" Ding Dong's body suddenly trembled, as if she had fallen into an ice cellar, and even her hands turned cold in that instant. She took a step back, but her body suddenly stopped. It was Li Ji who had grabbed her hand, and tightly grabbed it. He opened his eyes wide, and for some reason, his expression looked somewhat sinister. He took a step forward, and in an instant he got close to Ding Dong and stared at her. His gaze was as sharp as a blade, as if he wanted to see through this girl's deepest heart. Even his words, at this moment, seemed very sharp. "Before me, how many men have you slept with?" Ding Dong's entire body started to tremble, her face was snow white, and her lips were trembling non-stop. Her chest was heaving up and down intensely, but it was as if she was unable to breathe, and only tears kept flowing crazily. She looked at Li Ji and shook her head with all her might, but not a single word came out of her mouth. Li Ji clenched his teeth, and that handsome and extraordinary face of his was somewhat distorted. He angrily looked at Ding Dong, and suddenly swung his hand, throwing Ding Dong's hand away, and angrily roared, "You slut, why did you lie to me?" Ding Dong's body involuntarily staggered a few steps back, her face was covered in tears, and she cried out, "It's not like that, I really like you, I really want to live with you for the rest of my life. Who wants to live with you for the rest of my life?" Li Ji shouted, interrupting Ding Dong's words. His eyes looked a little red, and he gritted his teeth and said, "A lowly and shameless girl like you, a whore who can sleep with anyone, dares to dream about the immortal Tao, scram." Ding Dong seemed as if she couldn't even stand steadily, and in an instant, she sat on the ground, and her face was pale. Looking at Li Ji, she seemed to be somewhat incoherent. "You, how can you be like this? At that time when you asked me for money, and said those sweet nothings to me, you weren't like this." Li Ji kicked a stone beside him, and it directly fell into the dragon lake, and with a put-on sound, it seemed that at this moment his heart was also filled with anger. He pointed at Ding Dong, unable to restrain his anger, as if he was staring at a life-and-death enemy, and loudly said, "Why didn't you tell me clearly at that time? You used that dirty money to pave the road for me, but it was all for yourself, right?" Ding Dong laughed bitterly, looking at that man. Her face was still as pale as paper, and her tears did not stop, but her eyes seemed to have brightened a little. In that sorrow, she quietly looked at Li Ji and then said softly, "Li darling, I remember that you should be very happy to take that money and pave a road for yourself to ascend to heaven." Chapter 48. Li Ji clenched his fists once more. His face was ashen, but he didn't say anything for a long time. Ding Dong looked at him mournfully, her eyes gradually filled with despair. She didn't know where she got the strength from, but she slowly crawled up from the ground. The mountain breeze blew, and her clothes fluttered in the wind. Her pink dress was like a peach blossom in spring, beautiful and delicate. Her hand lightly brushed her face, wiping away her tears, but she couldn't wipe them clean. Her white fingers picked up her loose hair and placed it beside her ear, making her look more tidy and beautiful. Under the sunlight, the peach blossom-like woman trembled slightly in the wind. It was as if she was at her most beautiful and desolate before withering. She softly said, "Li, do you dislike me?" Li Ji didn't say anything. Ding Dong stared at him in a daze. After a while, she slowly lowered her head and said, "I know." Li Ji snorted and suddenly said, "Don't pretend to be so pitiful. Do you think I don't know what you're thinking when you suddenly lit a torch at the top of the mountain? Isn't there a lover at the bottom of the mountain that you're calling up? These days, you've been cuckolding me countless times." As he spoke, his face became incomparably angry as he stared fixedly at Ding Dang. Ding Dang shook her head, her face pale. I didn't do anything wrong. But if you must think that way, there's nothing I can do. If you don't want me, She seemed to be in so much pain that she couldn't speak. After a while, she gritted her teeth and said, if it wasn't for you, I would still want to cultivate. Give me back my spirit stones. At worst, we'll just become strangers. Li Ji angrily said, didn't I tell you just now? I don't have them now. 1,000 spirit stones is not a small amount. Wait for me for a while. At the latest, I'll return them to you in a year. Ding Dang put her hand on her chest and smiled sadly. You also know that it's not a small amount. How can I wait for you for a year? I don't know what you'll be like by then. In short, I beg you to give me a way out. Either bring me up the mountain or give me back my spirit stones. I'll take a trip to the immortal mirror. Ding Dang clenched her teeth and said, if that's the case, then I'll risk it all and make a trip to South Pine Mountain. Li Ji was startled and his expression changed greatly. He shouted, slut? What do you want to do? Are you trying to make me the laughingstock of the entire clan so that I won't be able to raise my head in the future? Ding Dang looked at Li Ji, her lips trembling a few times. In the end, she gave a perplexed smile, turned around and walked towards the mountain path. Li Ji shot forward like an arrow, grabbing Ding Dong's shoulder. He angrily said, what are you trying to do? Are you crazy? Why must you force me like this? I didn't force you. Ding Dang pushed him away and continued to walk forward, choking with tears. I am just an ordinary girl. I don't think so much. I just want. Before she could finish her sentence, Ding Dong's body suddenly stiffened, and she stopped moving. The lakeside of the Dragon Lake suddenly quietened down. It was as if even the slightest breeze had suddenly disappeared. Slowly, Tink lowered her head and looked at her body. A bloody blade had pierced through her abdomen. Dark red drops of blood slowly dripped down from the blade, falling onto the muddy ground below, mixing with the muddy mud, forming a dark color. An intense pain surged from her abdomen like a tidal wave, as if tearing her delicate body apart, crushing her heart. She slowly turned her head, with a trace of despair and disbelief. She looked at the man behind her. She pointed at Li Ji, crying out in a low voice. Li Ji growled, pulling out the blade, causing blood to splatter everywhere. Ding Dang wailed, her body trembled and was about to fall, when Li Ji suddenly grabbed her arm again. His right hand was like an Azura demon, and that cold blade once again pierced into Ding Dong's chest. Ding Dong's entire body shrunk, as if she was a child afraid of pain. Her pale face was devoid of blood, and she looked at the man beside her in despair. Li Ji once again pulled out the blade, and took a step back. Fresh blood gushed out, and instantly dyed half of Ding Dong's body red. Ding Dang slowly fell down. Her face still had a look of disbelief, but in the end her face slowly calmed down. She only quietly looked at Li Ji not far away, her eyes filled with sorrow and pity. Suddenly there was the sound of the wind, suddenly there was an angry roar, and suddenly a figure rushed out from the mountains, in a moment rushing in front of Li Ji, knocking him away from Ding Dong's side. Li Jiren was startled in midair, but he immediately turned his hand and stabbed the blood-stained blade towards the figure that was rushing towards him. The person who rushed out was Lu Chen. Facing the blade, he dodged to the side and punched towards Li Ji's face. Li Ji had already been a disciple of the Thousand Autumns sect for a period of time, and even though it could not be said to be a small success, it could be said that he had made some progress in the lowest realm of cultivation, the Qi refining realm. No matter what, he was still stronger than the average person. So when he saw that the person was the villager from Qingshiteng village at the foot of the mountain, he immediately laughed coldly, steadied his body, and raised his arm. As long as he blocked this sneak attack, then he would be able to kill this mortal without any cultivation. It would be a piece of cake. However, at this moment he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right thigh. In an instant, he felt as if his body was being torn apart. Li Ji screamed and retreated in terror. Looking down, he saw that when Lu Chen's fist was about to hit his face, his other hand had viciously grasped a black dagger. Moreover, it had mysteriously and silently avoided all of his senses, directly stabbing into his thigh. Immediately after, it viciously pulled to the side, fiercely cutting out a ghastly wound. This kind of method, this kind of evil, it was really something he had never heard of before. He obviously did not have any cultivation, and was just a normal person, but in reality, in an instant, he was almost defeated. Li Ji could not stand steadily, and directly fell to the ground. For a moment his eyes looked at the black short sword in Lu Chen's hand that was like a devil, and actually had some traces of fear. Lu Chen still wanted to go forward, but suddenly from behind he heard Ding Dang's voice. Lu Chen? Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment. Looking at the frightened Li Ji, he immediately put away the short sword, walked to Ding Dang's side, and hugged her body. In the blink of an eye, blood gushed out, staining the clothes on his chest. Lu Chen did not say anything, only lowering his head to look at Ding Dang's body. His gaze swept across the girl's bloody stomach, and then looked at the wound on her chest. Ding Dang trembled. Lu Chen silently hugged her tighter. Ding Dang looked at him with some difficulty and said in a low voice, "My injury? Can you still save me?" Lu Chen hugged her, and after a moment of silence, he slowly shook his head. Ding Dang began to cry. She cried in grief, her tears like pearls falling down, landing on her bloody body. After a moment, she looked at Lu Chen with hazy teary eyes, like an innocent child carrying her last hope, stretching out her bloody hands, and lightly and weakly grabbed onto Lu Chen's clothes, leaning her head on his chest, choking with sobs. Even her voice was trembling as she said, Am I going to die?" Lu Chen hugged her tightly, meeting her gaze. After another moment of silence, he said in a low voice, "Yes." Chapter 49. After the peach blossoms bloom in spring, they will eventually wither, falling from the branches into the wind and dust, turning into mud and dust, thus never to be seen again. Just like life, cannot keep your youthful smile, beauty and charm. We must part in the end. When the mountain breeze blew, the lake rippled, the beautiful but haggard girl leaned on his chest, waiting for the final farewell. Just like the spring wind was gone, the peach blossoms were about to fade. Just like that, they quietly withered. She slightly turned her head, looking at the faraway Li Ji who had fallen to the ground. Her eyes seemed to have some complicated emotions. Then she retracted her gaze, landing on Lu Chen. Her face became more and more pale, but her expression gradually calmed down, as if she had finally accepted the final outcome. She even forced a laugh in a low voice. No one knew what she was laughing at. Was it Lu Chen, Li Ji, or herself? "Hey!" Ding Dong's voice was so soft that it was almost indistinct. She said to Lu Chen, Have you ever liked me?" Lu Chen looked at Ding Ding, thought for a moment, and said, "I should have." Ding Dang laughed, although in the middle she violently coughed twice, and said in a low voice, "Lying again. Why would the person who likes me say that I should or shouldn't?" Lu Chen did not say anything, only quietly listening. Ding Dang sighed, weakly leaning on his chest, and then said, "I like that person, but it's a pity that I misjudged him." Lu Chen said, "Don't talk anymore, rest for a while." Ding Dang ignored him, lightly panting for a while, then said, "Lu Chen, I'm about to die. Can you promise me one thing?" Lu Chen looked at her and said, "Speak." Ding Dang laughed somewhat miserably, then turned her head to look at Li Ji, looking at the man with a face filled with fear. At this moment he was no longer as confident as before, but a trace of gentleness surfaced in her eyes, and then she said in a low voice, "I beg you to let him go." Lu Chen stared at Ding Dang. After a moment he said, "He caused you to become like this, he looked down on you, he also—" Ding Dang shook her head and did not refute anything, only saying one sentence, "I still like him." Lu Chen's voice came to an abrupt halt. He didn't say anything else and only silently looked at the woman in his arms. In the end, he softly said, "Is it worth it?" Ding Dong's hand that was grabbing onto his clothes slowly loosened, as if the last of her strength was gradually disappearing. However, she seemed to be much more relaxed, with a gentle smile on her face. It was as if she was at her most beautiful age, and her most gentle dream had finally come true, to have a person she loved to spend the rest of her life with. to be a celestial family, to be free and unfettered. She said to Lu Chen with a smile. With the dazzling blood and soul-stirring beauty of despair between life and death, she said, "Who cares?" Her head slowly drooped, but her gaze was still fixed on Lu Chen, and there was a hint of pleading in her gentleness. Lu Chen took a deep breath and said, "I know, I promise you." Ding Dang smiled, as if the last bit of her burden had been lifted. She no longer looked at the two men beside her, and her gaze turned towards the Dragon Lake, looking at the green mountains and clear waters, the lake and the mountains. A breeze blew, and her beautiful hair gently fluttered in the wind, giving off a strange sense of gentleness. "What a beautiful lake," Ding Dang said in a low voice and then closed her eyes. On Tea Mountain, by the Dragon Lake. Silence reigned. After an unknown period of time, Lu Chen gently put down Ding Dong's gradually turning cold body, and then stood up, walking towards Li Ji. Li Ji pressed on the wound on his thigh, and somewhat fearfully retreated. He was originally a young master of a rich family, and had never suffered since he was young. Even when his family fell, he still lived a much better life than most mortals. As for entering the Thousand Autumns sect to cultivate, because the time was too short, he did not truly experience the fighting and killing of cultivators. He would kill in a frenzy, but he would also feel pain and fear under the blood. Don't come over, don't forget, you promised Ding Dang that you wouldn't kill me." Li Ji shouted loudly. As he shouted, Lu Chen walked in front of him, looked at him, and then without saying a word, suddenly struck the back of his neck. Li Ji's shout came to an abrupt stop, and his eyes rolled back, his body fell forward, and in an instant he fainted. When Li Ji woke up again, he discovered that the surrounding light had dimmed, and looking at the sky, it was already dusk. There was still a burning pain coming from the back of his head, causing Li Ji to grit his teeth and groan in pain. When he sat up, he immediately discovered that the person he was most afraid of had not left. Lu Chen was still standing by the Dragon Lake, but at this moment his clothes, other than the blood that was originally stained with Ding Dong's blood, there was also a lot of dirt and dust. In front of Lu Chen, on the land beside the Dragon Lake, there was already a newly built lone grave. There was no tombstone, no pine, only a new layer of soil, quietly covering the woman who had already been eternally asleep. The grave faced the lake, facing the mountains and the water, like a woman placing her love in this picturesque landscape, smiling but not saying a word. Lu Chen turned around and walked in front of Li Ji with large steps. Li Ji immediately dodged, and for some reason, fear took control of his body. He clearly looked down on this person as a mere mortal, but at this moment he did not have the heart to resist at all, and only shouted, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Lu Chen grabbed the front of his clothes, and directly dragged him in front of the new grave, throwing him to the ground, and coldly said, "Kowtow 3 times. I'll kowtow, I'll kowtow." Li Ji hurriedly replied, and at the same time secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Since he was allowed to kowtow, then for Ding Dong's sake, he was spared his life. He heavily kowtowed, dong dong dong, 3 times, kowtowing deeply, and no one could say anything wrong. Then he straightened his body and said, "Is this enough? Let me go." Halfway through his sentence, a black light suddenly flashed past his eyes, and his voice was abruptly blocked in his throat. At that moment, Li Ji's heart suddenly contracted. He stared at Lu Chen in disbelief, and his entire body trembled. It was as if the black sword that came from the deepest part of the darkness was held in Lu Chen's hands, mercilessly and fiercely stabbing into his body. Flesh and blood were cut, and blood splattered everywhere. Li Ji loudly cried out, and rolled his body, wanting to escape to the side, but behind him, Lu Chen expressionlessly looked at him. A strange light flashed in his eyes. It was a black flame, like the flames of the 9 nether yellow springs, eating souls as food, maliciously looking down on the world. One hand grabbed his neck, and the other hand grabbed the black short sword. As if he was holding a pig, his face was filled with killing intent, and the sword fell, fiercely stabbing down again and again. One sword, one sword, one sword, one sword, one sword, one sword. He was like an evil spirit reborn from hell, cruelly and mercilessly appearing in this world, with a trace of madness and terrifying darkness. In the midst of the black flames, he used the black short sword to continuously stab into Li Ji's body, until all of his blood and life was squeezed out and crushed. Blood splattered in the air, dyeing Lu Chen's clothes red. The black flames burned wildly in the blood, like a crazy feast. "He promised to let me go." Li Ji, who had already become a bloody man, in the last moments of his life, desperately said these trembling words to Lu Chen. At this moment, Lu Chen, who was covered in blood like a demon, tightly gripped the short sword and took a step back, looking straight into the eyes of this person who was about to die, his face as cold as ice, coldly watching as he painfully breathed his last. Then he slowly walked to the side of the new grave by the lake. He sat down, looking at the lake and the mountain, as if speaking to himself, but also to the person in the grave. He said in a low voice, "Who cares?" Chapter 50. The setting sun was like blood, illuminating the sunset on the horizon. Under the setting sun, the Tea Mountains stood silently in the crisscrossing light and shadow. Even the tranquil dragon lake was illuminated by the twilight. There were still bloodstains on the ground, and a lone grave had been added to the lakeside. Everything seemed to have been cleaned up. What was left was to endure the wind, frost, rain, and snow of the years to come. When the darkness silently fell, there was no longer a trace of anyone on the Tea Mountain. Only a figure in the distance was walking further and further away, slowly walking into the darkness. When he saw the village at the foot of the mountain again, it was already after nightfall. The strange and mournful wind blew on the Tea Mountain again, echoing like the wails of ghosts and the howls of wolves at the foot of the mountain. The night was like water, and the darkness was like the tide. Hidden at the foot of the Tea Mountain, it made the grass hut seem especially lonely. Lu Chen walked down the mountain path. Apart from the bloodstains on his body, his expression had completely returned to normal. Those strange black flames had disappeared at some point, and it looked as if they had never appeared on his body in the first place. Not a single trace of them remained. He walked out of the hut and glanced at the village at the foot of the mountain before he entered. In the darkness of the night, the village was quiet. There was no light at all. It was as if the village had fallen into a deep sleep in this deep night. Lu Chen stood at the door of the grass hut and reached out to push the door. The wooden door creaked open, and the cold wind seemed to swirl behind him, whistling as it blew past. He took half a step into the hut, and his body paused at the threshold. In the darkness, the familiar grass hut was as usual. Everything was in its original place, and everything had the familiar smell. Even the bed in the shadows of the hut looked the same as when he had left it in the morning. Lu Chen stood quietly for a moment, and then he raised his gaze to glance above his head. Silence reigned. Not even a speck of dust floated down, much less withered grass. In the darkness, Lu Chen's pupils suddenly contracted. A mournful gust of cold wind blew past, like the wail of a ghost, with a bone-chilling chill, even though it was a summer night. Standing at the door, Lu Chen seemed to suddenly think of something. He stretched sleepily, shook his neck, and then looked back at the village at the foot of the mountain. He calmly retracted his foot that had just crossed the threshold. Then, he rubbed his stomach as if he was in a hurry to use the toilet. He looked around and then walked into the dark forest at the side. The darkness of the night rose and fell like the tide, filling the surroundings of the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. The forest was gloomy, as if it was coldly watching Lu Chen's lonely figure. The hazy atmosphere spread with the darkness, drifting around the grass hut like a ripple. It was like a ripple of ripples. It flowed silently from all around, gathering towards the grass hut. Lu Chen walked to the edge of the forest and even opened his mouth to yawn. He was completely unaware that the darkness behind him, as thick as ink, was gradually approaching. In the wind, there seemed to be a slight whistling sound, mixed in the night. Suddenly, the darkness suddenly flourished, like a calm river suddenly setting off a huge wave. The waves were turbulent, and the imposing manner was ferocious, with a hint of wildness and madness. And almost at the same time, even the moment before the darkness suddenly rose, Lu Chen, who was originally standing calmly at the edge of the forest with a hint of laziness, suddenly turned his body and directly pounced into the forest. In an instant, a burst of angry curses suddenly rang out. In the originally quiet and empty night, more than a dozen blurry shadows suddenly appeared, pouncing over from all directions. The snow-white light pierced through the deep darkness and refracted a chilling sharpness. It pierced through the void and slashed towards Lu Chen's figure. However, in that moment of danger, Lu Chen had already rushed into the forest one step ahead of it. Immediately, there was a burst of angry shouts in the forest, and the shadows swayed again. It turned out that there were actually shadows in the forest, but obviously not as many as outside. Or perhaps it was because they did not expect someone to rush in here, and were not well prepared, so there was some chaos in the forest. The shadows of knives and swords rose one after another, and the sound of the wind was mournful. Very soon, there was a muffled groan, and in the dark corner of the shadow, blood suddenly appeared. Outside the forest, the shadowy figures didn't hesitate and all rushed into the forest, bringing with them a murderous aura that was as strong as a mountain. Even the forest seemed to be tainted with the smell of blood. The mountain wind blew, and the forest shook violently, like a small boat shivering in the raging sea, but nothing could be seen inside. At night in Qingshitang village, it was mostly quiet and dark. But on this night, the village seemed to be especially quiet and dark. The only light was in the small pub in the village. There was a candle on the table, a pot of wine, and a cup. The young child was drinking by himself. He poured a cup, took a sip, and shook his head. He smiled warmly and said to the side of his feet, "This wine is not good." The small pub was very quiet. Other than this young and gentle man, only old Ma was still here. He was still dressed the same as in the day. Because it was too hot, his upper body was bare, and he only wore a pair of large underpants. But at this moment he seemed to be in extreme pain and disheveled. His hands and feet were tightly tied by thick ropes, and he was thrown on the ground like a fat pig waiting to be slaughtered, just beside the young child. The sentence that the young child said just now was directed at old Ma. At this moment, old Ma did not look good. His face was bigger than usual because of the swelling. There were bruises everywhere, as if he had been beaten up badly. The corner of his mouth was cracked and bleeding. But compared to his body, these were not worth mentioning. On old Ma's white and plump body, there were no less than 7 to 8 large wounds that were about an inch deep and a foot long. They crisscrossed on his chest and abdomen, including his back, which was badly mutilated. It was difficult to find an intact piece of skin on his body. Below him, blood had gathered into a pool, and it seemed to be slowly seeping into the ground. At this moment, old Ma seemed to be dying. He laid on the cold ground weakly. Other than his chest that was still moving up and down, only his eyes were barely open. He looked like he could die at any time. After hearing that sentence, old Ma's dazed eyes flickered. He lifted his head and actually smiled, although the muscles on his face were twitching when he smiled. He said, "This is the countryside, I can't help it." The young child smiled warmly and looked at old Ma with a hint of admiration in his eyes. He said, "So, have you thought about it?" Chapter 51. Old Ma mumbled something, but no one could hear what he was saying. The young man shrugged his shoulders and said indifferently, "It's up to you. He's a dead man anyway. It doesn't matter if you don't know his identity." Speaking of this, he glanced at old Ma again and seemed to think of something. Suddenly, he said with interest, "But I'm a little curious. What kind of person and what kind of shadow could make you clench your teeth so tightly that you'd rather die than reveal the secret?" Under the dim candlelight, old Ma grinned, and the young man looked at him with a smile. Two completely different smiling faces stared at each other in an incomparably strange manner. The wind blew coldly outside the house, and the night grew darker. At the foot of Tea Mountain, countless shouts rose and fell amidst the shrill sound of the wind. Most of the sounds came from the dark mountain forest, and there were also all kinds of saber lights and sword shadows mixed in. The battle was extremely intense. But because it was too dark, It was impossible to see what was happening in the forest from the outside. Even the figures flashing between the trees could not be seen clearly. But suddenly, at a certain moment, the sounds in this forest suddenly quieted down. All the clamor was like a cliff, suddenly disappearing. It seemed extremely abrupt. The night was dark like ink, but also like the mouth of a ferocious monster, full of malice. Gradually, footsteps sounded in the forest, breaking the sudden silence. Strange voices echoed in a low voice, as if they were communicating with each other. Some were angry and some were anxious. After a while, human figures flashed, and someone walked out of the forest. It was a masked man who was covered in black. Behind him, there were many other men in black who wore the same clothes as him. Many of them were holding shiny weapons in their hands, and the red of some of the blades could even be seen on them. The air was filled with tension and killing intent, and at the same time, there was a faint smell of blood. Where is he? I don't know. He suddenly disappeared. What the hell? Search again. This forest has been searched carefully. Did he escape to the mountains again? That's impossible. The guards outside didn't see that shadow at all. It looked like the leaders of the black-robed men were standing together, talking quickly and fiercely with each other. It seemed like they had different opinions and were even arguing with each other. After arguing for a while, the black-clothed men were finally divided into two groups. Half of them continued to search here, while the other half went down the mountain to the village. There were about 10 black-clothed men left at the foot of the mountain. They quickly dispersed, some searching the forest, some guarding the path up the mountain, and some returning to the thatched hut to rummage through the chests and cabinets. An uproar broke out under the night sky. One could tell that the black-clothed men were rather flustered and exasperated. Perhaps it was because such an accident had occurred while they were heavily surrounded, causing them to appear even more tyrannical. Not long after, a cry of surprise suddenly came from the thatched hut, as if someone had discovered something important. There was a hint of surprise in the voice. There was a sudden commotion among the black-clothed men outside the thatched hut. Several of them followed, including those who were searching in the forest. At this time, someone had already lit a torch in the thatched hut. Under the light of the torch, the people inside and outside the hut could clearly see that under the bed in the thatched hut, there was a flip-up board and a secret passage. This discovery made many black-clothed men very happy. As they spoke, someone had already carefully picked up a torch and began to explore the secret passage. At the same time, in the depths of the forest that had quietened down outside the hut, a figure suddenly stood up in a dark corner. There was a strange aura in the darkness. It was cold and had a hint of killing intent. In this corner, darkness was everywhere, but the figure seemed to be particularly thick, like ice that could not be melted. This figure took a step out, and the face slowly appeared. It was Lu Qin. As his figure swayed, one could vaguely see that there seemed to be another figure lying on the ground behind him, but it was lying on the ground motionlessly. But the strangest thing was that at this moment, Lu Qin had changed into the black clothes worn by those black-clothed men. What was even more strange was that strange black flames were burning in his eyes. He gently raised his hands, and there was a black cloth in his palms. Then, like those black-clothed men, he covered his face. Instantly, all traces of his appearance were covered, as if he had been one of those black-clothed men from the beginning. For some reason, even his temperament was so similar. He glanced at the thatched hut in the distance outside the forest and frowned slightly. In the quiet forest, he stood quietly. After a moment, he thoughtfully glanced in the direction of the village at the foot of the mountain. That shadow is a person who encountered an accident. After being seriously injured, his cultivation was crippled. He is almost no different from an ordinary person. A calm voice echoed in the small tavern. A few black-clothed men stood at the door and lowered their heads to listen to the young man's words. When he spoke, he sounded very calm, and there was no angry expression on his face. But for some reason, these black-clothed men looked a little afraid, and their bodies were trembling slightly. You, a dozen or so people, all of you are cultivators. You surrounded a mortal with no cultivation, and you actually came back to tell me that he escaped. The young man smiled as if amused by his own words. He said lightly, "That doesn't seem right." The man in the middle of the black-clothed men standing by the door, after hesitating for a moment, finally gathered his courage and said, "Young master, that guy is not an ordinary person. A few of our brothers fought with him. That person's attacks are fierce, and his attacks are very fierce. He should not be underestimated." The young master sitting at the table furrowed his brows. It seemed that he didn't doubt the words of the black-clothed man's subordinate. A trace of suspicion appeared in his eyes as he muttered to himself, "What's going on? Could it be that those idiots in Zhengxianming found fake news?" The group of black-clothed men did not dare to speak. Then, a clever gaze suddenly swept over the fat old Ma, who was lying on the ground in a very miserable state. He said, "Young master, why don't we interrogate this fat man again? He must know the news of that shadow." Old Ma tilted his head, and suddenly spat a mouthful of bloody saliva toward the door. He cursed loudly, "F***CQ, you can't catch someone, so you vent your anger on me? If you have the guts, go and catch that guy." Chapter 52. An ominous glint flashed in the black-clothed man's eyes, and he took a vicious step forward. The young man frowned, and there was a hint of impatience in his eyes. Just as he was about to speak, there was a sudden commotion outside the tavern. The young man's expression darkened as he shouted, "What is it?" A man in black ran in from outside the tavern and said anxiously, "The mountain is on fire." Everyone in the tavern was shocked and hurried to the door to take a look. Indeed, in the darkness of the night, 6 or 7 places on the Tea Mountain were on fire at the same time. The fires did not seem to be connected yet and did not seem too big. However, the flames were bright and burning fiercely. They rose with the howling of the mountain wind. It was obvious that it would not be long before the mountain was set ablaze. There was a moment of silence among the men in black. Suddenly, someone cursed and someone was about to rush up the mountain but was immediately stopped by the young man. He looked around and his expression turned cold for the first time. His voice also carried a hint of coldness as he said, "This place is less than 30 miles from South Pine Mountain. Once the mountain fire gets bigger, the Thousand Autumns Gate will definitely send people over to investigate. When that happens, there will be no time for you to mess around." The men in black were all silent. After a while, the young man laughed coldly and suddenly slapped the folding fan in his hand. He said in a low voice, "Set the house on fire. Kill the fatty in the tavern. Let's go." Very quickly, in the silent night, the light of the fire quickly lit up the surrounding area, surrounding the tavern in the middle. From the effect of the fire, it was obvious that this group of men in black were experts. Who knew how many times they had set the place on fire in the past? What was strange was that although the commotion was so big that night, other than the inside and outside of the tavern, the other places in Qingshitang village were still quiet. There seemed to be no signs of the villagers being alarmed. At the same time, in the small tavern that was gradually engulfed by the raging flames, 2 black-clothed men had already rushed in. They dragged out the dispirited and pitiful old horse and threw it on the empty ground in front of the tavern. The young man walked over with a solemn expression. It seemed that at this time, due to all kinds of accidents, he finally couldn't maintain that indifferent expression. He said solemnly, "Fatty, I respect you as a man, but you have seen the situation now. I will give you one last chance. Tell me the identity of that shadow and where he is now. Otherwise you will—" He gave a look to his side, and the 2 men in black who caught the old horse pulled out their shining blades at the same time. The man on the right moved slightly faster, and directly placed the blade on the fat man's thick neck. The man on the other side was a step slower, and after a moment of hesitation, he put away his blade and took a step back, standing among the crowd. As the cold blade was placed on Old Ma's neck, Old Ma couldn't help but shrink back. His face was pale. It was obvious that he was still nervous. He couldn't help but raise his head to look at the man in black. Perhaps it was an instinctive reaction at the moment of life and death. His body trembled violently. Then he stared at the man in black who was about to kill him. It was as if he wanted to remember the murderer's face and turn into a ghost to take revenge. Unfortunately, this black-clothed man's entire body was wrapped tightly. Even his face was covered by a black cloth, revealing only a pair of eyes. Old Ma glared fiercely at the man in black. The man in black was unmoved. The young man on the other side seemed to have run out of patience. He said coldly, "Have you made up your mind?" He paused for a moment and snorted. He waved his hand and said, "Do it, don't." Suddenly, a scream came. It was Old Ma, the fat man, who suddenly shouted. In an instant, his original iron-blooded and unyielding temperament disappeared. He suddenly changed into a depressed and flattering look. He shouted loudly, "I'll talk." Who? There was a commotion among the men in black, including the young man, who seemed to be caught off guard. He was stunned for a moment and couldn't react for a while. The man in black standing next to the fat Old Ma seemed to be more frightened. He staggered and almost fell. Then he seemed to be very angry. He lifted his foot and kicked the fat man. Ouch! Old Ma rolled on the ground twice. He looked like a lump of fat meat. He grimaced for a moment. The young man on the other side came to his senses. He hurriedly stopped the man in black who seemed to want to beat the fat man. He walked quickly to the side of Old Ma and said seriously, "Ma Shaun." As soon as he said that, even he himself frowned. He felt that the name was too different from the fat man in front of him. However, according to the secret report from Zheng Xianmeng and Fuyunji, this person did have this name. But at this moment he couldn't care so much. He took a deep breath and said, "Ma Shaun, listen. My name is Shang Fei. I'm the Deputy Lord of the West Altar of the Three Realms Divine Sect. As long as you tell me the truth, I guarantee that you won't have to worry about Fuyunji for the rest of your life." "Masha," the fat Old Ma nodded and said, "Thank you, thank you. You must save me." Shang Fei nodded. There was some anticipation and nervousness in his eyes. He said, "Tell me quickly. Who is the shadow hiding here?" There was silence, and all the men in black subconsciously held their breaths as they listened. The night breeze blew past, and only the crackling sound of the fire burning on the tavern's roof could be heard. In an even more distant place, in the depths of the thick darkness, a faint and indistinct sound could be heard, as if someone's water buffalo had finally been startled, letting out a mooing sound. Old Ma gritted his teeth. It seemed that he had gone through the last struggle in his heart. He even looked back at the man in black who was holding the knife. It seemed that he was very afraid of the knife. After a moment, he said, "I don't know the original name of the shadow. But when I picked him up, his name was Lu Qin. He is 28 years old this year and has a medium build." Shang Fei raised his eyebrows and nodded slightly. Obviously, he seemed to know the basic information of the shadow. It also proved that the fat man in front of him had indeed told him everything. He said, "Well said. What else?" The fat man hesitated for a moment. The man in black standing next to him seemed to despise this fickle villain very much. With a low shout, he placed the knife on Old Ma's neck and shouted, "Speak quickly." Chapter 53. Old Ma shrank back and looked frightened. He stammered, I'll tell you. I heard that Lu Qin came from the chopping wood pavilion. He was talented, but arrogant and conceited since he was a child. What's more, it was said that he was very lustful. He fell in love with the only daughter of the chopping wood pavilion's master during his cultivation, and then they became lovers. Later, when the matter was exposed, the chopping wood pavilion's master was furious and wanted to kill him. This scum went all the way. He even falsely accused the chopping wood pavilion to Zheng Xianmeng of colluding with the devil cult. No, the divine cult, which attracted the masters of the Heavenly Law Hall of the Immortal Allies to fight with him. In the intense battle, this person was heavily injured and his cultivation was crippled. But because some important people in the Celestial Alliance wanted to save face, they protected him. After that, he was transferred to the Floating Cloud Agency and became a lazy shadow that was just waiting to die. But even here, this person still doesn't do his job properly. All day long, he seduces women and harms them. He has a bad reputation in this village. As Shang Fei listened, he slowly frowned and looked a little disappointed. But then he couldn't help but snort coldly and said, "Is this person so despicable?" Old Ma nodded repeatedly and said, "Yes, yes, this guy is so bad. There is no good part of him." Moo. Shang Fei seemed to want to say something more, but from somewhere in the darkness, there suddenly came a cow's moo, and this time it sounded a lot clearer. Shang Fei was stunned, and there seemed to be a little surprise on his face. He suddenly turned around and looked into the darkness. It was deep in the night, and the darkness was like ink. He stared at the darkness, and the expression on his face changed. Suddenly, his face changed dramatically, as if he suddenly felt something at this moment. He shouted, "Not good, run!" This shout came so abruptly that none of the black-clothed men around could react for a moment. Instead, the tied-up old Ma and the black-clothed man standing beside old Ma with a sharp blade in his hand raised their heads and glanced at somewhere in the darkness at the same time. Suddenly, a pair of giant eyes appeared in the ink-like darkness. Each eye was as tall as a person. Although the body of the monster could not be seen due to the darkness, one could imagine just how terrifying the monster in the darkness was just by looking at the pair of eyes. This part of the world, this part of the night, also seemed to suddenly freeze. Everything was still, not even the wind could move. A moment later, in the darkness, from the direction of the terrifying giant eye, an unimaginable howl suddenly rang out. Moo! That was the third cow's moo that night, but it was far more terrifying than the previous 2 times. A violent breath instantly condensed in the darkness in front, and then rushed over like a surging river. In an instant, it covered the sky and the earth, shrouding the entire village. The darkness was like a real thing, like a violent giant rushing forward, suddenly strangling everyone in the field. All of the black-clothed men screamed in an instant and covered their ears. Those with weaker cultivation could not even stand steadily. In the crowd, in this sudden attack, only 3 people remained calm. Shang Fei was one of them, but he did not seem to be in a good state either. This violent roar seemed to be mixed with incredible power, and it directly caused a dark red line of blood to flow down from the corner of his mouth. In the blink of an eye, Shang Fei was shocked to find that not far away, the fat man on the ground and the black-clothed man holding the knife standing beside the fat man did not seem to feel anything, as if they were injured or had any reaction. At this moment, an extremely absurd feeling welled up in his heart, but with life and death in front of him, how could he care so much? He felt that the roar did not seem to be affected at all, and it was even getting fiercer. The darkness in front of him seemed to be boiling, and it was about to press down, as if the sky was about to collapse. Shang Fei screamed, his voice was sharp, and he leaped up. Then, a yellow light suddenly flashed on his body, and a palm-sized wooden figure that was very similar to him suddenly flew up and blocked in front of him. At the same time, there was a loud roar in the darkness, like a surging tide. Those black-clothed men on the ground who were holding their heads and screaming with all their might, except for the one standing beside old Ma, suddenly froze, and then a terrifying scene appeared. All the black-clothed men's bodies suddenly exploded in an instant, and countless blood turned into a blood mist that sprayed into the night sky, forming an incomparably mournful scene from hell. Almost at the same time, the wooden figure that Shang Fei released seemed to be hit by a huge force, and with a bang, the figure instantly exploded and turned into smoke, turning into countless pieces that scattered in all directions. In mid-air, Shang Fei screamed, but it stopped abruptly, as if he had suffered a heavy blow. At that moment, he did not dare to stay any longer, and directly turned into a white shadow, desperately flew away, and disappeared into the depths of the distant darkness in the blink of an eye. The terrifying and strange roar gradually subsided, and the strange scene in the night sky also disappeared. The remains of those black-clothed men fell to the ground, and the dark red blood mist rushed into midair, and then gradually turned into a mournful blood rain, slowly falling down. Unknowingly, there were only 2 people left in this scene. Old Ma looked up at the black-clothed man standing beside him, and the black-clothed man lowered his head to look at old Ma. For a long time, The two actually did not speak. It was not known whether it was because they were too shocked or because of other reasons. After another moment, Old Ma's body suddenly tilted, and he suddenly gasped, as if he had touched a certain injury. For a moment, he was annoyed and angrily scolded, "Fuck you, come over and untie me." The black-clothed man snorted, raised his hand, and chopped down at Old Ma. Old Ma shrank his head and felt a chill on his body. The blade cut dangerously in front of him, and then he felt his hands and feet loosened, and the rope was cut. Then, the black-clothed man threw away the blade in his hand and took off the black mask on his face, revealing his face. Impressively, it was Lu Chen. Old Ma's injury was not light, lying on the ground for a while, and he could not stand up for a while. Then he angrily looked at Lu Chen and spat, "They can't even kill a person with no cultivation, what a waste." Lu Chen shrugged, looked at Old Ma, and said, "After so many cuts, you are still not dead. God is really blind. Get out." Hiss! A painful hum came out of Old Ma's mouth, and he slowly sat up with the help of Lu Chen. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.